gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Sometimes I'm gaining, then again I'm losing. Sometimes I'm rising, yes, sir. Then again I'm falling. Let Jesus work it out.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos. And today I'm joined by my friend, scholar, researcher, and amazing Substack hoster, Jose Miguel. How you doing, brother?
Doing well. I'm looking forward to this today's topic.
Yeah, me too. And for anyone out there, today's topic actually stemmed from last week's conversations. For those you don't know, Jose and I are now doing a weekly show on Thursdays. And last week we were talking a little bit about the split of the American right wing, the conservative movement, however you want to articulate that. And one of the things was brought up, or I brought up, and then he thought would be a great topic because of his background in the Tejano Mexican American culture, is the imagery of the cowboy. And the cowboy as truly the last American archetype, or at least the most significant one. And the cowboy imagery stands at a unique point in American history. It's post-Civil War. It was I don't even say pre-modern, but certainly the modernization of America regarding cars, electricity, all that stuff really takes place at the beginning of the 20th century. So there's really like this interesting 40-year window in history where we get the entire mythos of the American cowboy. And you look at America right now with this sort of identity crisis, as we'll discuss, and we see this resurgence, whether it be Kevin Costner in Yellowstone, Morgan Wallen, Ella Langley as Billboard Top 100 hits. I looked, in fact, we'll get into it, but in the top 100, 5 out of the 10 are country songs. So it's interesting to see when the World Cup came, people flocking to Texas and buying cowboy hats and cowboy boots and enriching themselves in this sort of American identity. And the cowboy is really, if you think of what icon does America have that someone in Europe could see and immediately recognize place, setting, historical context, it's the cowboy. And we don't have the chivalrous knight like some of the Europeans do. We don't have ancient cities, but we have this yearning for the frontier, this cowboy imagery. So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. Jose and I have not shared any of our prep. So I've gone through and really thought about the archetype, why, how the cowboy actually emerges in history. And so it's going to be fun to see what we get into.
Indeed. The other part too is, although for the American experience, the cowboy was there for about 40 years, the actual life of the cowboy goes back more than 2,500 years.
Right.
So I'm hoping that I mainly focused on the origins and history of where cowboy culture originated, how it developed over time. And to some people's surprise, it was always it was actually the Reconquista that turned it into a warrior class, which we will dive a bit into. And then, so I've essentially did a bunch of, most of my research is focused on that history all the way up into the Spanish settling of the Americas, and then the contact with the Anglo-American settlers had with the Tejanos in particular in Texas when they were settling in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and how the Americans effectively adopted and blended, in particular, Scotch-Irish Scotch Irishness into it. The cowboy was not really the cowboy identity or culture was not really identified by Yankee Dum or Dixie. It was specifically identified by or adopted by and internalized by these backcountry boys or Scotch Irish boys from Tennessee. Right. So yeah, I'm ready to begin at the beginning whenever you want me to roll.
And before we do, just want to remind everyone, go subscribe to Jose's Substack. So if you are interested, and that's part of what we do in these streams, these streams that we do together are going to be basically a lot of historical deep dives. They're going to be fun-ranging topics, free-flowing conversations. And if you enjoy content like that, I promise you guys, you would love Jose's Substack. And that link is in the video description. I've already included it. Go click on that. And while you're over on Substack, go follow my Substack as well. I just started one. But definitely highly encourage everyone. And maybe after today's conversation, because I'm really excited for today. I think I took a very religious studies, interdisciplinary approach to analyzing the cowboy and its regard to American civil religion, the American mythos or sacred canopy. And I already knew Jose, because we talked last time, he's going to provide us the historical foundation, the part that most Americans have never even heard of regarding the cowboy and how it emerges. So smash that like, guys. If you have any questions and comments, feel free to send those in. And you can use Streamlabs, Dono Chat, or YouTube. We have a 20 super chat goal for today's YouTube conversation over here. So, all right, to get started, why don't well, how about we do this? Before we even dive into the intricate history, why don't we just talk a little bit about why the resurgence of the cowboy?
Well, I think a big part of it is men. Well, personally, I suspect a chief part of it is it's man's internal rebellion against modernity. It's a parallel to why the Return of the King, for example, it resonates with young men across the entire Anglophone world. There's fundamentally a spiritual dissatisfaction with modern democracy, modern ways of government, which you see arising with the popularity of Lord of the Rings. And there's also not discomfort, but frustration with modern life and how enchaining everything is and how everything is just set up against you. And whereas the cowboy gives this image of a man who roams on the range, who goes where he's able to go, who lives a semi-nomadic lifestyle and moves with the seasons.
Yeah. No, and one of the things I wrote down is why in the techno age, because part of the pretext for today's conversation, as I kind of mentioned in the opening, is that you look at some of the most popular television shows in America right now, and they all have this Western, rancher, cowboy aesthetic. You see the top music, for example, let me pull up the Billboard Top 100. I'll show you guys what I mean. And this is, if you remember, there was conversation probably 30, 40 years ago that country music was sort of going to die out with the rise of pop music. It became incredibly popular. And so I looked in preparation for today. Hip hop rap music is still the largest music genre in America based on streams. So if you look at like Spotify and which music people are streaming, it is still number one. However, if you look at the individual songs that are the most popular, you'll see Ella Langley's Choosing Texas, Taylor Swift, again, in kind of a country vibe, Morgan Wallen country, Stella Lefty country, Ariana Grande pop, Ella Langley, Morgan Wallen country, Olivia Dean, I think she's like British. So you get that, then back to country. So it isn't until you get down to the 23rd most popular song in America that you even get hip hop and rap, which is the first time in I forget how many years that was even the case. So that's just one little case example that I mentioned last time about this interesting revival. And so I looked up what are the fastest growing genres of music in America. And it fits perfect with today. It's American country music and it's Latino music. Like, so again, obviously demographics and stuff like that. But if you listen to like Mexican music, and I'm not talking about, Pitbull, I'm not talking about pop music. It's artists
ranchero.
I haven't heard of. But those two genres in America are the fastest growing, which is very interesting. And I asked, why is that occurring in the techno age, right? 40 years ago, it was speculated that country music would get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I argue that there's a few reasons. One, there's a sociological theory by Peter Berger called the sacred canopy. It was developed in the 60s and the 70s. The idea is that every culture that exists has this process he called legitimation, that we externalize, objectify, and then internalize symbols, myths, stories, heroes. And the people who legitimate and share and reside under the same sacred canopy, this is what you would call a tribe or a culture or an ethos of human orientation towards ultimate values. And somewhere in, I would say, the 1960s, that cultural fabric was totally ripped in America. And we've seen, the counterculture in the 1960s essentially has infiltrated and taken over the institutions. So when we think of progressivism or DEI or critical race theory, free love, these values were inculcated in the 60s and then entrenched into American life, where I argue we have a split cultural canopy. What most academics argue is no, America has a new secular sacred canopy, which again is like diversity, multiculturalism, science, these types of things. And there's so many sociological or sociologists, academics that write about the new sacred canopy of a religion or of America. My point is that those are if we have a competing sacred canopy, we don't have any sacred canopy at all, because the idea is that everyone resides under a sacred canopy. So because of that, America doesn't have an identity. And we've said this so many times, and Jose and I talked about, what is an American? Is it the Nigerian who just got his citizenship from living here for 12 years? Is it the European, let's say the British that just immigrated? Is it the heritage American that has British ancestry? Is it the Tejano? Is it the Mexicans in, Southwest America and Mexico? What is it to be an American? And that's a fundamental question. It's really hard to answer in our cultural context. And so the cowboy is an interesting myth, and after Jose lays out the history and the origins of the cowboy, we'll get more into the archetype and how the cowboy arose as a mythological figure in America, because that was kind of what I focused on. But the point in which in the techno era that we're in, the cowboy is explicitly a form of embodiment. The cowboy says that reality is encountered physically. He rides, he shoots, he tracks, he hunts, he ranches. He endures the elements. Cowboys sleep outside. Cowboys endure the heat. Cowboys endure so again, the idea of creaturely comforts, the idea of getting your Uber Eats, like this is antithetical to the ethos of the cowboy, whether you're conscious of it or not. And so the cowboy is this sort of embodied figure. And where we're moving right now is people are becoming more and more disembodied. You can think of the movement towards transhumanism, or just people living in their head, or the health crisis. People even don't take care of their physical body. And so why the comeback for the cowboy? This is my opinion. The lack of American identity, the crisis in masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? And we'll get into, because I have both critiques and positives to talk about the cowboy, or orthodox critiques. But it's indicative of a form of masculinity. It's embodied, it's place, right? So why is it that when the Norwegians or the French or the Germans came to America, when they went to Texas, they buy the cowboy hats? Because I saw the city of Houston reported how many sales they had in cowboy hats and cowboy boots during the World Cup. It's because it has place to it. It has historical context. What can you go? Every metropolitan city in America looks like a metropolitan city in Europe. Now, Europe has aesthetics, they have architecture, they have history we don't have. But what is there to do? Like, what is the unique American iconography that you can have? Well, for the Europeans, immediately it's the cowboy, it's the pioneer, it's the frontier, it's the man of radical freedom. And there's a sense of natural beauty with the cowboy. He's outside, he's mountain ranges, he's horseback, he's doing cattle drives. There's a yearning and a nostalgia in the American mind to return back to that which is natural. Again, the cowboy fulfills that. And there's moral clarity. We'll get into the actual cowboy as a laborer versus the mythological cowboy as a cultural hero, because that was actually something that emerges right after the Civil War, especially with dime novels. We'll get into that. But the mythology of the cowboy and then all the Western films, that happened in the 20th century, is that the cowboy represents a form of moral clarity in a world of chaos. That whether he enters the city with, the robbers or the corrupt sheriff or whatever it may be, the criminals that are on the hunt with a bounty, the cowboy represents this man who is rooted in that which is natural and yet also has total moral clarity and can see. And now again, where do we exist today? Is there moral clarity today? And so that's what I mean by there's like this unconscious yearning for the cowboy because of what he represents, though people may not be able to articulate that. And the last point that I have is why there's a renaissance of the cowboy imagery, is that it relates to a sort of American inheritance. What do we inherit in American culture? Is it the Ford Motor Company? Is it, Rockefeller Oil? Is it corporatism? The only thing that you can really grab a hold of and say, this is uniquely American, this is what we have that no one had, is the cowboy. And I think that's why there's this unconscious nostalgia and, like I said, a renaissance of cowboy and Western imagery right now in America, because it provides identity, it provides some type of moral clarity, it provides a sort of recognition of who we are. And underneath that, gender roles, right? You don't find transgender cowboys. You rarely find homosexual cowboys, despite the movie Brokeback Mountain. That stuff was not popular. And you find a returning back to the land, right? People are fed up with the screens, but we can't give it up because we're addicted and we're being controlled by it. But the cowboy represents somebody who's total freedom. And his freedom is a level of self-sufficiency, right? We are not self-sufficient as modern Americans. The cowboy is literally an archetype of total self-sufficiency. That's what his freedom is. It's not the liberal modern freedom of you can do whatever you want, hedonism. That's not cowboy's freedom. The cowboy freedom is self-sufficiency and competency. That's what allows him to be free. And so those are some of the reasons why I think that it's making a huge cultural comeback. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. It's cowboy in the American mind, to bring in an orthodox parallel. It is the equivalent of the Cossack to the Russian mind. The parallel between the two are extremely strong, and even in history, there's a reason for that, which we will get to from the 17th century. It's one the idea essentially of a man, who's outside, who's in the real world, who's in real beauty, who faces real danger,
yes,
and yet manages to thrive.
Right.
And that's something that's every exists in the heart of of every young American man that's growing up, especially a man who finds himself, be it trapped in suburbia or trapped in an urban hellhole, or even trapped in, for example, in a sense, trapped in poor rural society, like where I am. We do have cowhands, and there are actually a couple of men who do commute to work on horseback. So they still exist. It's just much, they're no longer doing the long cattle drives like they used to.
Right.
But the horsemanship and the horse culture and the rodeos, they still exist. They still thrive. And if anything, they're growing.
Yeah. No, that's what there's another article I read in prep was saying that rodeos in the South are becoming more popular. Is like in the last 4 years or so, they've been seeing an uptick in attendance at rodeos.
Mm-hmm. And I'll go into what the rodeo originally was too, because that's actually the one. It's people ask about sometimes, like if you read my works or listen to some of my podcasts, people notice that I tend to have an axe to grind with the American North, with the Civil War, and one of the main reasons actually is because of the rodeo. Carpetbaggers who came down from Texas passed a bunch of regulations and rules that tamed the rodeo and reduced the competitions greatly reduced the competitions from the intensity that they used to have. And that's something we will get into. It's not that I'm anti-Yankee per se, but I dislike the Yankee carpetbaggers that came down here and decided to make things safe and make things humane. So that's, we'll get there.
Yeah. Well, why don't we start off then? Help walk us through I guarantee you, for many, the unknown history
Mhm.
of the Spanish origins of the American cowboy.
So this is the fun part. So it goes back farther than we know in written history. So before the Romans civilized and taught how to build aqueducts and indoor plumbing and stuff like that to the Hispanus, which is what they were named before Rome, before what they called themselves before Rome civilized the Iberian Peninsula. Before the Carthaginians set up their colony on the south, which was eventually conquered by Rome and built the city of Cordoba. In the area, especially around the area around Seville, but along the river that runs through to the ocean, all that marshlands, etc. That was you had wild horses that would always be running there, as well as cattle, and you always had this vaquero culture that existed there before Rome, before Carthage. So we don't even know how far back it goes, but cows essentially dominated these marshlands and grasslands. And these huge herds were means for men with no land, no title, no nothing, were able to get food and sustain food for their family, as well as make money, in particular from the sale of leather. And of course, they used the whole cow. So, for example, bones would be turned into glue, stuff like that. So the cowboy identity, or the origin of the cowboy, is very much not just Spain in general, but in particular Andalusia. And this plays a huge role. So the three portions of the Americas that we're going to focus on for this part of where cowboy culture started, or rather the vaquero culture took root in the New World and started growing into separate cultures, was the grasslands of La Plata, which is Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile, as well as the grasslands of Gran Colombia, which was the border, in particular the grasslands on the border between Venezuela and Colombia. And then, of course, El Norte, which includes Texas, New Mexico, California, and what we refer to as northern Mexico, like Nuevo León. Those are the three places where these cowboy culture took hold of in the New World and became something very, very similar to its forebear in Andalusia, but also very different. So first comes the development of these cowherders into a distinct culture within Spain. So you had the marshes of Doñana and Bajo Guadalquivir, which essentially bred cattle since forever. The two cattle breeds that they exported to the New World that are critical are the Marismeña and the Mostrenca. And out of this, you actually get the Texas Longhorn. So whenever you see the Utah-Texas Longhorn symbol, that this is where it comes from. What's interesting is during the Islamic invasion, so despite the Islamic hatred of dogs, interestingly enough, the Berbers kept dogs as working dogs. They were permitted to do so.
They weren't Middle Eastern though. Berbers are North African converts. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So the Berbers brought over these working herd dogs, which the Spaniards adopted and didn't just have for cattle herding, but also used as pets as well, which the Berbers did not do because Islam definitely forbade doing that. Right. So the distinction that existed within Islamic Spain was the Berbers kept dogs solely for work. The Spaniards used them both for work and as essentially an extension of the family. The rodeos, which we mentioned before, that now are becoming more popular in the American South, not just the Southwest. These were medieval Spanish Spanish competitions. So where you had jousting as being the big thing in like France, in Spain, the rodeo was the big thing.
Right.
What do you call it? Yeah. So and of course,
the running of the bulls. When
yes,
did that start as like a Spanish ritual of some sort? I assume it's tied to the vaqueros.
It is, but I actually don't know, and I should have looked that up. So I have to say I don't know, and I'm gonna have to look it up later.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off. When you were talking
perfect.
about all that, it connected for me.
Exactly.
I didn't do the depth of the historical research you did, and I kind of picked up my little history like 1500s after Cortez and the indigenous mixing of Spanish culture. So I appreciate. I knew you were going to bring thoroughness and historical, so I appreciate it.
Yep, and I'm glad you caught a missing thing. I'll have to look it up after. But the fun part is the rodeo included bullfighting, and bullfighting was very, very different. And we'll get there when we get to how the Yankees banned it, because it played a critical role in how the Texas Rangers were originally trained. It was one of the first Texas Rangers set up an Anglo-Saxon rodeo for the purposes of teaching Americans how to do rodeo and how to do the various competitions they would do, which included bullfighting. So I know the oldest livestock roundup tradition still in practice is the Saca de las Yeguas festival in Doñana. That's where they essentially round up horses, and people choose the horses that they're going to be using as their mounts. So within Spain, vaqueros we used to run cattle from central and northern Spain to Seville as for processing. Also, it was the major city that was a port or inland port to the rest of the world. The big thing about Seville is it was inland, so it was more defensible from outside invasion. But you also have that giant river, so that you can actually still get goods going out to sea where it can be shipped both to the New World as well as in older times, to the Mediterranean. So it was always a major port, and it became the port to the New World in the future. So horsemanship itself, so the horsemanship of the vaqueros, of the original cowboys, was also influenced by the Berbers. So also Arabs a bit too. Arabs from the breed of horses. So Arabian horses are pretty famous, and they have their own mythology to them. You can look in both the American, even in the American mind, you can look up films of, for example, like the Black Stallion, which is about a black Arabian horse, as well as Hidalgo, which is one of the tall tales of Frank T. Hopkins, who himself is an icon of the old American West. He was a man who would get free drinks, meals, and places to sleep based on his ability to spin tall yarns, tales that entertain people, before the days of radio and television. And of course, one of his far out there tales was Hidalgo, which about the American cowboy that goes to the Middle East and does I think it was like a 3,000-mile race in the official telling against a bunch of Muslims, and barely managed to win. Check out that film with Viggo Mortensen. I really enjoyed it. I know American historians hate it because it's not in any sense historically accurate, but that's not kind of the point. Frank T. Hopkins was a man who spun legends and stories that reflect the life of the American Midwest, West, Old West. Yeah. And so I do recommend that. And I greatly enjoy that film, and I love sharing it with my kids. So. You're right. And so the big thing, so the New World, you have these three major grassland areas. You already have this vaquero culture that had been in existence for more than 2,000 years by the time that Columbus discovers the New World. And one of the first things Spain did to bring over was they brought over the cow, as well as chickens, pigs, etc. And that's how you get the wild boar that run around that I like to hunt, as people consider them a pest, but they feed my kids and they're cheap. So it's... the cow essentially dominated all those three grasslands we previously mentioned in the far south of South America, in La Pampa, as well as in the lands shared between Venezuela and Colombia, as well as the north. And all the cows that exist there, they all came out of Andalusia. So with the colonization, this is the critical part too. So Andalusia alone supplied 50% of all the settlers of the Spanish Americas, and also even the Philippines. And it was because of the significance of Sevilla as the New World port. So 1 in 3 women who settled in the New World. So the idea that it was mostly men is not true. They actually did bring women. But 1 in 3 women who settled in the New World in the 16th century were born and raised in the city of Seville alone. Cadiz and Huelva were the other 2 cities that supplied a substantial population of women in particular. It was the Charros of Nueva España and El Norte which is the ones whom the American cowboy formed from or borrowed from. They directly came from the Guadalquivir marsh culture with some Castellano admixture. So very heavily Andalusian with some Castellano, which is where, Castilian Spanish, that's where that comes from. Whereas the Huasos, which were the Chilean group that I forgot about last time we talked, they were also Andalusian primarily, which makes sense given what they were, as well as with Castellano admixture. The Gauchos, on the other hand, in Argentina, and this is why Argentina and Chile have different cowboy cultures, the Gauchos were almost completely and totally Andalusian, like no admixture whatsoever. Rio de la Plata was originally named Nueva Andalucia because of this. It was only later it got renamed to La Plata. And today, of course, in Argentina, you have many other flavors from the Spanish Peninsula, and that's because Galicians, Basque, and Asturians came in mass in the 19th century, post-independence. Argentina received about 4.5 million Spanish from the rest of Spain from all the other non-Andalusian Spain in the wake of their Argentine independence. So the Llaneros, who were the group in Venezuela and Colombia, they were also primarily Andalusian, but they stand out because they have admixture from the Canary Islands, which are the islands off the coast of Africa, which the Spanish had settled, and was also used as a stop on the way to the New World.
Right.
So that's what differentiates those four groups. So I'd say the Huasos and the Charros are the most similar culturally speaking. The Gauchos are the most similar to their original Andalusian mother or father, and the Llaneros are their own thing with Andalusian mixed in with Canary Island culture. This is where the concept of what I label it as the cowboy wrangling history. So the riding form, which was actually adopted from the Berbers and the desert cavalry that the Berbers had, it's referred to as a jineta, the jineta riding. So it was adopted from the Berbers. It was a style of riding with short stirrups, which results in the rider sitting with knees bent with vertical posture. So this is very ideal for a light cavalry, where you're wielding a lance and you're not wearing much armor. European horsemanship was very focused around heavy cavalry in the medieval period, as anyone who knows the medieval battlefield. Right. So horses were bred to be huge. They were bred to be crazy strong. And it was expected that the horse would be wearing heavy armor, plus carrying a heavily armored knight. They were effectively the tanks of the battlefield, right. And would smash into enemy lines. Jineta riding is not at all suitable for that kind of riding, that kind of warfare. But for a light force, be it light skirmishers, even cavalry archers, or javelin throwers on horseback, Jineta's riding is very, very useful. It makes the horse much more maneuverable. And this is something that the
Byzantium dealing with the Arabs.
Yep.
Right. So once you get into the 630s, after Muhammad dies in 632, you get the unification of the Arabs. I mean, immediately by 640 and 650, the Arabs are on the conquest, and they're taking over. The Rashidun dynasty or caliphate there is taking over all of the Middle East. And what made them so effective is the Byzantines were of the same style as the medieval knights, and they had typical Roman formations, or what would become the medieval knight. Typical Roman formations, bigger horses, armed cavalry. And the Muslims, like the Turks and these nomadic groups, were just incredibly agile on horseback. And a big old blocky military force, especially if you fell for a feint retreat, had no, they just couldn't deal with the quickness and the maneuverability and the agility of these other style of horseback warriors.
Yep. And this carries over directly into how cowboys rode and did the long trails, etc., with their cattle. The style for heavy knights that also is used by Byzantium with their cataphracts, as well as the Persians with their cataphracts, because the cataphract originated with the Parthians, if I remember correctly, would be referred to as alabrida. So that's the more traditional, like this is heavy cavalry riding. So one thing that I really do like that didn't really carry over into the American cowboy, but was everywhere in Andalusia, as well as in the various groups that I mentioned before in the New World, was the garrocha. So the garrocha was something that essentially it's a hardwood staff, and it's used for directing cattle from horseback, as well as used in traditional bullfighting and in the traditional rodeo. So it was 14 feet long in terms of design. So the equivalent I could find for English society in medieval English society would be the quarterstaff and the longstaff. The quarterstaff being about 9 feet and the longstaff being 12. So since this was meant to be used on horseback, it's of course a bit longer. It's 14 feet. But just like in the English tradition, where the shepherds would use the quarterstaff for guiding their sheep, as well as as a self-defense weapon, the garrocha served the same purpose in the Spanish Peninsula especially during the Reconquista. So it was not just used for herding cattle; it was also used and trained with as a weapon. Interestingly enough, not just for the purposes of self-defense carry, although that was the primary use. The vaqueros of Spain served in the Reconquista as light cavalry, and they fought like the Berbers did, as you mentioned, the Berbers and the Arabs as light cavalry units. The vaqueros themselves come from a poorer strata of society, so they're essentially society that couldn't afford armor, shields, etc. But many of them could have, they had their garrochas, and they would use that in combat. So many Muslims had encountered a very, very hardwood staff regularly for about 700 years. during the warfare that happened throughout the frontier during the Reconquista. So there is a sport that survives to this day. It's the acoso y derribo, which it's a surviving traditional sport where two men bring a bull to the ground using the garrocha while they're both on horseback. So that's and that was something that was also part of traditional rodeo long before the carpetbaggers ruined everything, which we will get to. And of course, at this time in the Reconquista period, we see, of course, we see spurs. We see the wide hats that would eventually become the cowboy hat, as well as, like the Mexican sombrero and the various hats that the gauchos and the huasos and the llaneros are also known for wearing. And of course, the environment where cowboys, the vaqueros, would practice their skills, the rodeo, which all of it was about. This is why bull riding was a thing. How do you, if you can ride a bull, you can tame it and ride while riding on its back. If you develop that skill set, that's useful when you're handling bulls as you're, guiding them through the marshlands and getting them to do and go where you want them to go. So, moving on to those big groups within the New World, post conquest of the New World. So, starting with the llaneros, so they're named for the Llanos grassland of Colombia and Venezuela. They themselves are mainly mestizo with some African admixture. They're interesting because compared to the others, and this is the influence of the Canary Islander in them, they were historically very well known for being champion swimmers and champion boaters. So they were excellent horsemen, excellent boaters, and excellent swimmers. And they're the only of these subgroups of vaqueros. They're the only ones who were like that. And during the Wars of Independence, they served as the light cavalry for both the Royalists and the Masonic aristocrat rebels alike. Going back down to one of the other groups, and I want to get the other groups out before we get to the ones that the American Cowboys copied, would be the Gauchos of Argentina. So they were interesting in that they were wholly nomadic, in particular the Las Pampas area of Argentina and Uruguay. So they were not just herders, but they actively hunted and corralled wild cattle and horses for a living. So those giant pasture lands, escaped cows, escaped horses would freely thrived like crazy without any predators on those grasslands. And so you had these massive hordes of cattle and horses that were popping up everywhere and just dominating these grasslands. And the gauchos would move from place to place, and they would essentially capture and retame wild horses and wild cattle. That's how their culture, essentially, their specific cultures formed. So historically, in the imperial and the post-independence period, they dominated Argentine and Uruguayan scout forces. Very similar and parallel to how the Tuvans today, and even for the past, even World War II, the Tuvans dominated the Russian scout forces. Right. Just being a horse people who are nomadic, everything related to scouting, they're going to be good at just because of how they were up, because of their culture and how they're brought up. What's interesting is, so Argentina, as most people know, is probably, if we're looking at football teams, probably the whitest Hispanic country. Second to Uruguay.
I always say Argentina is the most European of the Hispanic nations.
Yep. And this is where things get interesting. So the gauchos, in comparison to the predominant Argentine culture, were actually very mestizo. And it's interesting. And the reason is because they're descended from the Andalusians who came over, who maintained the nomadic way of life. They absorbed all the nomadic natives who lived in Argentina and Uruguay, who were also living a nomadic life and didn't want to live in the cities. Right. And so many of those natives, when they, who lived as nomads, when they saw that, when they converted to Christianity, they had a choice where, they could maintain their nomadicism and join up with the gauchos, or, settle in urban life. And they almost all of them, and you can walk in any city in Uruguay. You can go to, Montevideo in Uruguay, or Buenos Aires in Argentina, and you can see how the urban population is super, super white. The natives overwhelmingly were like, we want to stay being nomads, and so they intermarried with the Andalusians who maintained that nomadic way of life. And so that's why the gauchos are historically very mestizo. And that's how the natives were absorbed in that area. So their specific gear, so they had specifically the bombaches, which is their riding pants. They had a unique style of poncho, and they had interestingly enough, their knife, the fason knife, is it's the national knife of Argentina, But it doesn't originate in Andalusia at all. It actually originates with the Portuguese facano. So I don't know how that exactly happened, but the Portuguese blade was adopted by the Andalusians, who kept the nomadic way of life in Argentina, and now that specific blade is Argentina's national knife, similar to what the Bowie knife. One could consider the Bowie knife as the national knife of the United States.
Right.
The façon is the equivalent in Argentina, and then of course they also have a very deep lasso culture for lassoing cattle and horses. So, and interestingly enough, the Gauchos have a very common thing with the American cowboy, which is their way of life ended, their nomadic way of life, which was wholly nomadic, ended when English settlers and post independence. The Independence Party within Argentina was funded by the British Crown and the British Masonic lodges. They sent down a bunch of English down into Argentina to settle, and they brought with them, of course, barbed wire, which is what ended the nomadic lifestyle of the Gauchos. And so the closing of the commons, the open commons, the open prairies in Argentina happened at the same time as it happened in America, and thus the Gaucho has become part of the, because it was there from the beginning. In the case of Argentina, it's definitely a huge part of the Argentine psyche, the same way that the cowboy is of the American psyche. And interestingly enough, it was killed by the both of them were killed by the Anglo-Saxon invention of barbed wire. In the final closing of the commons, which was started under King Henry VIII.
Right.
So the group after that is the one over in Chile, the Huasos, they have more Robin Hood like. Well, the rosy view would be more Robin Hood like oranges. So origins. They originally were horseback bandit bands, so outlaws from the Spanish crown during the imperial period and into the independence period. So cattle raising was one of the major money makers in the Spanish Empire. So most people think that conquistadors were looking for gold and silver, and that was actually not true. So Cortez, for example, he didn't make his money from gold; he made his money in silk, because he started up silk manufactories and silk growing plantations in Mexico. In the case of the thing that was actually the most viable export from the New World for the Spanish Empire was sugar. Sugar out of Cuba, the Dominican Republic. Sugar was essentially, it was the cocaine of its day, and it still is the cocaine of its day. And it started rotting European teeth 500 years ago, and it's still rotting our teeth today. Yeah. So it's but after sugar, after silk, which was actually a huge industry in New Spain. The next thing that came up as the biggest exports was meat. So if you notice that Europe, outside of Spain, you don't really have that much grasslands open within Western Europe. Right. You don't get open grasslands until you get to the Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, where of course you had the Cossack hosts who were on the steppe. So because of that, essentially, the New World had a comparative advantage in cattle production. So the cattle herding became such a huge deal in the Spanish Americas as a whole, that these bandit groups decided that it was actually more profitable to take up cattle herding than to keep living off of robbing other people, which is what they did. And that's how the Huasos became the Chilean version of cowboys. And yes, they did choose it because that's how big the industry was for cattle. It was truly more profitable to be a cowboy herding cattle than it was to be robbing being a highway bandit, robbing people of whatever they happen to be carrying. Their specific gear, they were known for the Chupala straw hat, or Chupaya straw hat, the manta, the Chimanto poncho, which is a unique poncho that they wore that's distinct from what the Gauchos wore. Their tooled leather leggings, which were different than the bombaches of their neighboring Gauchos. And then they had long shanked spurs in particular. They had wide rowels, which people can look up online. They're various gear. I'll get to it, but there's a guy who's very good visual historian who drew sketches of all the traditional wear of not just the various types of the riding cultures of the New Spain and La Plata, etc., but also the American cowboy. He was an artist out of El Paso, who we'll get to. Now we get to the group that matters for the American cowboy the most, which are the charros. So the charros were overwhelmingly mestizo and, unlike the other groups, civilized Christian natives. So the North, when it was being settled, the settlement wasn't led by conquistadores. It was led by the church, by the missionaries. So you had many native tribes which converted, adopted. Many of them adopted agriculture, but there are also ones who wanted to keep living nomadic lifestyle. And these Andalusians who were, moving, living on nomadic lifestyle with cattle, they would join up with them, intermarry with them. But you also had plenty who weren't even mestizo, but were just straight up fully native, especially in Texas. An example of, for example, modern example of someone, a Tejano, who has that super native look would be Roy Benavides, who was an American war hero in the Vietnam War. So the character Rambo was based off of him. Rambo was a combination of two men, Roy Benavides, the Tejano, as well as the Texan Audrey Murphy. Who was that war hero, very famous. So those two men combined was what the author who invented the character Rambo was thinking of when he created Rambo. Sylvester Stallone's take on Rambo drew much more heavily on Roy Benavides because his life was much more like an action hero than Murphy, who was also a war hero and a very noble American. What I find amazing is that the Rambo character is a blending of a Texan hero, an Anglo-Texan hero, and a Tejano hero just joined together in this fictional character that is also cemented in the American psyche. Of course, Sylvester Stallone is tall, very white looking, and whereas Roy Benavides in real life, he was essentially like mostly Yaqui native, so very short, very very Native American looking. But he was literally the type of guy who literally would run into machine gun fire, pulling wounded and dying men out and getting them to the helicopters for the Cav to take them back home. And that's how he ended up winning a gold, we call Medal of Honor. And if you ever read, I recommend reading his story. Maybe we'll do a thing on it in the future of these various war heroes. He really crazy story of what he did under duress in combat, saved a bunch of American lives. And as a side note, they had this thing, back in the Biden administration where they were renaming the forts. So Fort Hood became Fort Cavazos. That actually made a lot of local Tejanos I know angry, because Cavazos is Mexican. He's not Tejano, because again, Mexicans are not Tejanos. Tejanos are not Mexicans. And because we do have a local war hero, a local hero they could have used if they really wanted to, rename it to someone who was from here. They could have named it after Roy. Because he's very popular, he's well liked. Even the Anglo-Texans and the old Scotch-Irish family who built a lot of towns out here as well, alongside the Tejanos out here. Everybody loves Roy Benavides. Like, the guy's awesome. But of course, Washington being Washington, they select a Mexican guy to make everyone angry. So, but yeah, so the Charros were, as I mentioned before, mestizos and mixed, with Christian, a lot of Christian natives. They were definitely the best horsemen of the North. And they, in particular, they were formed by Philip II into what were called the soldados de cuera, the leather soldiers. They were the equivalent of the Spanish equivalent of Cossacks in the New World. You had this giant open steppe, essentially. And the king was trying to figure out, King Philip II was trying to figure out, okay, how do we keep peace on this giant frontier? We got all these different tribes, all who have conflicts with each other. And also, some who like to do a lot of raiding, enslaving, etc. And the Spanish crown at the time was becoming less and less friendly to slavery in general over time. So the solution he came up with, he was looking around like, okay, what has someone else done to tame the steppe and deal with, hostile natives, shall we say? And then he was looking over across Europe, looks into Russia, sees the steppes, and he sees these Christian Cossack hordes running around. And Philip II was like, okay, there's my solution. So he formed the Soldados de Cuera, who are essentially Spanish hordes. And he drew from the vaquero population of Texas primarily, as well as New Mexico and California. Literally the same exact stop. And so their gear that the Soldados de Cuera had was exactly the same as that of the Charros. They were drawn from the same stock of people, but they were the formal warrior class, the same way that the Cossacks were a formal warrior class for the Tsarist Russia. So that is one of the parallels that the Spanish Empire did have with the Russian Empire, and it's also why I say for Hispanidad as a whole, the Orthodox nation / civilization I do recommend looking to is Russia, because there are many things that we copied from the Russians, And there are many things that we got wrong that resulted in our civilization fracturing into 24 pieces that Russia got right. So the way that Father Turbo recommends Black Americans to look to Serbia, I do recommend to Hispanos who are coming into Orthodoxy to take a serious look at Russia and Russian history. It's because a lot of the what errors exist, the errors that were committed within Spanish history, Russia provides solutions, like intangible solutions within history. So the Soldados de Cuerda were the vanguard of the northward settlement north of the Rio Grande, alongside the missionaries. The Tejanos, what do you call it? Where would I put this? Yes, so Tejanos themselves were overwhelmingly this blended Andalusian peasant stock with the native tribes of Texas. And this is actually pretty significant because if you look, your average Mexican in central Mexico, their native root is Mexica, Mexica, Aztec, as well as, other Nahuas like the Tlaxcani and the other Nahua tribes. And then, of course, southern Mexico, you have, the native root is Mayan, as well as other minor Yucatan tribes as well, Mayan being the most prominent and the biggest ones. So in the case of Tejanos, their native admixture isn't any of those groups. And this is part of why they do have a distinct look. And even in the imperial period, you had a Franciscan monk who wrote an ethnography of the Tejanos and how they differed from central Mexico and southern Mexico, and how they were a very distinct people, a very distinct, mestizaje. They were a very different mix. So as mentioned before, Yaqui were one of the native tribes that were drawn in, as were the Caddo were a huge one. The name Tejas, Texas itself, comes from the Caddo language. It's usually translated in most history books as meaning friendship. It was supposed to symbolize the friendship between the Caddo who had converted to Christianity and the Spanish, the Andalusians who came and settled. But it's actually deeper than that. It's not just friendship. It means when two people come together and become one through intermarriage. Like, that's what it actually means in the Caddo language, originally in the Caddo language. And that's what happened, where the Caddo and the Andalusians who settled intermarried and formed what would become eventually the Texan cowboy culture. So this is where the history gets interesting and starts developing, and you start seeing patterns that carry over into the American concept of the cowboy. So as the charros of the North, who historically were poor, the vaquero was a job that were men who were broke and had no other means to support themselves or support their family. The charros in the North, because of how rich the grasslands were, started getting wealthy. And so you started having class division within the charros themselves. So you had an elite class that wealthy from the cattle trade, who built cities like Laredo, San Antonio, Corpus Christi, Matamoros, etc., like all these various towns that you see throughout southern Texas in particular. This class divide is actually how a very distinct Tejano rodeo style came about. So while the working charros worked, the wealthy ones who owned 4,000-acre ranches that they were managing found themselves with free time. And so in the 18th century Tejanos, they actually had these jokes that the real cowboys are the vaqueros. So they kept the old name, the ones who actually do the work with the cowboys, whereas the charros in the Tejano framework of the 18th century were the play cowboys, aka the Jeffersonian gentleman cowboys, who wore the gear and rode horses, but weren't really, enduring the elements because they lived in their haciendas. So and these wealthy charros took rodeo to what I would consider its ultimate heights. So you have, of course, the bullfighting, which everyone knows from Spain and exists throughout Latin America. Unfortunately, places where, I'll be frank, small hat tribes happen to take over, bull riding tends to get ended. And places where people who aren't necessarily small hats but are allied with the small hats, like Colombia, they crack down hard on eliminating on bullfighting. But the original bull riding that these wealthy charros of Texas came up with, these gentlemen, Jeffersonian, refer to them as Jeffersonian gentleman cowboys. So the bull riding we know of today that you can see in an American rodeo was far, far more intense than what you see today. So you had to, you're in an open thing like a bullfighting arena. You have the bull there. You had to rope the bull. Then you had to get your saddle on it. You're not in a cage getting a saddle on it. you had to get the saddle on it with the bull there. So, and if that isn't crazy enough, you got to get on it somehow. And then after that, you had to get it to stop bucking. Just like you do, like bull riding today is you just hold on for as long as you can. Right. You actually had to get the animal to stop bucking and quote unquote.
Right. So essentially what you're saying, original bull riding was about breaking the bull.
Yes.
Whereas today it's not about breaking. In fact, they encourage the bull not to be broken because it's just riding for, trying to hit your 8 seconds.
Yep.
But you're saying historically it was literally the process of how you break a wild animal to domesticate it for riding.
Yep. And the reason for this again was because you had, just like the gauchos down in Argentina, you have these wild cattle ranges. So you had feral cattle and they wanted to tame them, make them productive, productive for human use again. So you had to be able to break the bulls that led the herd. So that's the practical origin of this. But this is the crazy part. It got even crazier. So as I mentioned, the bullfighting aspect of the Spanish tradition, there was a fellow Jesuit priest, Rafael Landivar, in the 18th century. He wrote a book called Rusticatio Mexicana, but he describes how after you break the bull and you're on top, by the way, this whole entire time, while you're trying to break the bull, you have a garacho. So you have your lance, a blunted lance with you the whole time. Once you're on top and you've got the bull broken and you have your garacho, they would release another bull. And you had to then you have to fight that bull to the death. So bullfighting, but after you already broke a bull that you're riding and you're using as a mount to then tame the other bull.
Wow.
This was not actually like just for the sake of just being a badass, being a badass. This actually had practical reason for it, because even like the gauchos down in Argentina and the charros up in El Norte, there were many a case where you as a cowboy or a vaquero, you got unhorsed and you still had you had cattle around you that you were trying to tame. So if you're doing a thing where you're with a bunch of other men trying to corral up a bunch of wild cattle, if you get unhorsed, this was actually practical. You would actually get on a bull if that's all you had available, break it, and then get back to directing other bulls with your lance. Wow. So this was actually practical training, not just and also because if a bull's trying to kill you, which they are, it's better that you kill the bull instead of you. So this was also a training thing for the vaqueros, and that was the original rodeo that these wealthy charros perfected into a sport. So this spread from Texas, all over northern Mexico, and California as well, and New Mexico, this is where with the Americans coming in. So you have the initial American settlements in the wake of the Mexican independence. They had the issue where
people a time frame here. So we're talking about the early 1800s. So like what I had roughly around 1800 is when what we would consider the practices of the cowboy. I'm talking about roping and riding, clothing, ranching practices. These are essentially already perfected by the vaqueros. And the settlers are beginning to encounter these people at the early 1800s. And that's when they begin to adopt these practices. And 1821 is Mexican independence from Spain. So that's the time frame that we're talking so far.
Mm-hmm. So, and the reason why the Americans were brought in too was because the Masons who were running the Mexican Republic, they screwed themselves over. They decided to break the treaties, the longstanding treaty with the Comanche, and the Comanche, being a culture that really, really hates liars, wanted to punish the Mexicans hard. And so the Mexicans were having the problem of constant Comanche raids deep into Mexico. The Comanches themselves being master horsemen. And as mentioned last time, they avoided the New Mexicans, and even many Tejano towns they avoided because they blamed Mexico City. They didn't blame the Tejanos and the New Mexicans for the treaty violation. So the Mexicans brought in, the Mexican Masons brought in originally American Masons, who in turn brought in Americans who weren't Masons. So no, not all the original Texan American Anglo settlers were Masons, just the elites who were, interestingly enough, like Sam Houston and Santa Anna were actually were even in the same lodge at one point before the whole blow up of the Texan Independence War. But the bringing of the Americans was to essentially increase the population of Texas so that the Comanche could be fought back to protect the heartland of Mexico from these constant Comanche raids. So Americans were coming in the 1820s. One of the first Texas Rangers, H.L. Kinney, he really enjoyed watching the Tejano rodeos and saw the practical use of it, given that much of the land, so the land in the east was useful for growing cotton, but the land in the west and the south was mainly useful for cattle. So he saw the value in adopting rodeo practices, and he actually promoted this style of bull riding and bullfighting that I just described for the Texas Rangers as a training technique for them. So the original Texas Rangers would engage, to make it into the Texas Rangers, you had to learn how to break a bull, and you had to learn how to fight another bull on the back of the bull you just broke. And that was the training for one of essentially the hazing ritual for the original Texas Rangers. And personally, I'm a huge fan of bringing that back, because it would also solve the problem of women who think they want to be able to do law enforcement. So it's strike two birds with one stone. Unfortunately, down the line, this gets later as the rise of, of course, you have barbed wire becoming a thing at this point. But in 1891, post Civil War, you had lots of, as they're referred to as carpetbaggers coming from the north, especially from New England, who got very, very, very predominant in state governments. In 1891, they banned all the blood sport, what they saw as the uncivilized blood sport parts of the rodeo. So gone went the bullfighting components, and they imposed a bunch of regulations that made bull riding the much tamer version of what we now see today. So the original intention, unfortunately died as an outcome of the carpetbaggers that came down post-American Civil War. And this is why I have a bit of an axe to grind with the Eternal Yankee, because it is an erasure of the Tejano history of Texas. And anyway, that's the thing. And it was a tradition that's unfortunately was killed a little over 100 years ago. They also, at the same time, they banned bare knuckle boxing at the same time. And this is actually very important, because this still exists in Texas state law. So under Texas state law, you can challenge someone. Texas is one of the only, it's not the only state. I believe Washington might be the other, but Texas is one of the very few states in America where dueling, non-lethal dueling, is legal.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and I've seen it myself. It's fun. But you can challenge someone to non-lethal combat in Texas. So, and I saw Tejano actually challenge a Baptist over, because the Baptist had disparaged the Theotokos, and this Tejano challenged him right there on the spot, and it was hilarious because both of them, he's of course the Tejano out here is carrying, so he pulls out his revolver and holster, hands it to a third party, challenges the guy to to legal combat right then and there, unless the guy apologized for insulting the Theotokos. So this is just an example. This is still legal in Texas under Texas law, and boxing to resolve differences is very, very Tejano, and it still is legal under Texas law. And I'll give the state credit now. At least they when they banned bare knuckle boxing, they stopped trying to enforce it among Tejanos, because it's too ingrained in the culture for conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
They eventually, and so it was 1895 where they banned boxing in general. And the Yankees, they did reinstate boxing in 1933. The original rodeo has never been reinstated, but in 1933 they reinstated boxing, but with regulations that make boxing worse. So they required, under state law, padded gloves, which make injury, especially head injuries, far, far more common. I was looking at the numbers, and for bare knuckle boxing, like professional bare knuckle boxing, CTE is unheard of, and the odds of getting a concussion is a 15th of that with padded gloves, padded glove boxing.
Well, that not only padded, they tape their wrist.
Yeah,
so there's a big conversation in fighting regarding whether one should tape. If you don't have taped wrists, you can't hit so hard, and actually, even though it's bare knuckle and the visible damage may be worse, the mental damage actually may be better.
Yes. No, it is, and the numbers are very hard on that. So these Yankees who are banning all the blood sports to make things safer, in fact, made things worse because the padded gloves does mean less bleeding, like significantly less bleeding. There's been a restart of competitive bare knuckle boxing, and bare knuckle boxing, the knuckles are actually surprisingly sharp, at least for a man. If you're a woman, don't do that. Bare knuckle boxing with women's bone structure is a terrible idea, but a lot of, especially facial lacerations and a lot of bleeding in bare knuckle boxing, but risk of serious injury, especially head injury, like crashes like crazy. And you look at professional bare knuckle boxers. I did, this is years ago, I did a survey of like all the bare knuckle boxing champions across the 19th century, and looked at their lifespans compared to the boxing champions post gloves. And as you mentioned, taping of the wrist plus gloves.
Right.
And it's a night and day difference. Like professional prize fighting champions,
Right.
lived into their late 80s. There's no indication of like Alzheimer's or dementia or going slow in the head at all. So it's just an example of how liberalism and its desire to make everything better and cleaner happens to make things worse.
Right.
I'll go.
I was going to say, do you mind, just for the clarity of the audience, returning back to the sort of timeline for everyone to understand, because you gave us a whirlwind of history. So beginning of the early 1821, Jose was talking about the Mexican independence. Realize that when we are talking about the cowboy, when we're talking about the Wild West, we're talking about this brief period of history. And it isn't until really 1845 the U.S. annexes Texas, and Texas cattle culture enters this sort of expanding American national story. Now you have the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, and the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. And this is really the turning point. So imagine America, this expanding nation, vast frontier and territory, conquers all this territory through the Mexican-American War. And the Civil War then creates this huge post-war cattle supply that Jose was talking about with the sort of predecessors to the American Cowboy. And in basically, so the 1860s and this is a debated topic. You can get so many different questions. When did the Wild West end? When did the age of the cowboy end? Well, there's a few different demarcations. So if we take the rough estimate that the 1860s, even though people were going out west, you could really begin it from the 1840s. The 1860s are sort of our iconic understanding of the saloon and the Wild West and these small towns, that by 1870, when is it? 1874 is the beginning of the barbed wire phenomenon. So some historians actually cite this as the ending of the cowboy, because the cowboy, as understood in American mythology, is one who's roaming massive territory with cattle herds, doing cattle drives, going from Texas to Colorado, from Colorado to Montana, over to South Dakota, back through Nebraska, back down to Texas. Massive territory they're riding and herding cattle. And with the arrival of barbed wire, you essentially get the frontier openness begins to decline. Now, some people will point toward the beginning of the railroad system. So by the 1870s and certainly through the 1880s, you're getting a huge investment into railroad moving westward. You could say, because even then, even with barbed wire, even with the railroads, there's still this unique Western territory. You still have the gold rush. So what we would understand is there's aspects of the Wild West still present. But once you certainly get to the arrival of the car in the 20th century, so 1916 is really the total end of the cowboy. And the rise of the mythology of the cowboy is actually really fascinating, because this unique icon immediately starts to get mythologized in the American mind immediately. And so you can see these dime novels beginning in the 1860s. So we already mentioned that 1860, 61 being the beginning of the Civil War, already kind of the birth point of what we would consider the American cowboy. But in the 1960s, you're starting to get these dime novels like about cowboys fighting, robbers and criminals and thieves or corrupt sheriffs, and it creates this cultural milieu of people reading about what's going on in the frontier. Now, imagine you're in America, you know that all this territory exists, but you don't have television, you have maybe radio, so you have no idea what's going on. And so these dime novels start informing people on the East Coast and the Midwest about what is happening in the West, and creates this sort of fantasy. And then you get people like Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, where the West becomes a spectacle in which Americans can come and observe. It's really a transitional period, something that is, and remember, there's two, the way that I present is that there's essentially two cowboys. There's the real cowboy, which is a laborer, right? This really not a glorified job to a degree. It's very arduous. Now, certain men are cut for it, and certain men, this is their dream, this is their passion. But the mythology of the cowboy is this cultural hero. And I argue for today's stream that the American cowboy is the European knight, that the chivalrous knight of, you think of England or France and Germany, that imagery is exactly, or that archetype, I should say, that archetype is the archetype of the cowboy. He is our knight. He is our chivalrous victor in the face of chaos, in the face of evil, in the face of corruption. And so Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows become this thing. It's a sensation, by the way. We don't understand as Americans, but going to one of these shows, watching them, lasso cattle, watching them ride horses, watching them jump over things, watching them reenact Native American battles. This is, for the American mind, this is totally novel and fascinating. And then right after, so this is during the height of the cow. So this is 1880s, right? 1883 is sort of the beginning of these Wild West shows. And you get Frederick Remington, this American author, writes a book about, or writes multiple books, again, related to these dime novels, essentially totally codifying the aesthetic of the American cowboy. Now, this guy's living in New York. He doesn't even go to the Wild West. But at this point, remember, the Cowboys is existing at this very interesting point in culture where we're getting photography. So photos can be taken of Native Americans, of cowboys. We can see what they're wearing. And so all of this stuff really begins to take off in the 1880s as a cultural phenomenon. And you have Theodore Roosevelt. And I bring up Roosevelt, you make me think, like, why is Roosevelt related to the archetype of the cowboy? I would argue that Roosevelt provides this frontier tough man philosophy that reinforces the myth of these men in the West. And again, he becomes president, he becomes influential, he becomes an icon, his speech, Man in the Arena. And then Owen Wister, well, I was looking at some of the academic articles on again this archetype, the history of the cowboy, and I saw multiple people refer to this book that I've never read. It's called The Virginian, and it was published in 1902. And almost every article I was reading cited this book as massively influential for the full cementing of the American cowboy as a true heroic archetype for the American mind. And then in 1893, so as we said, the 1870s is where we start to see the barbed wire. By 1893, you already have Frederick Jackson Turner writing about the frontier thesis. And what he's arguing is that the frontier no longer exists. And he wonders what this is 1893. And he's writing that, and many people have now critiqued it and all this stuff, but it's historically important because it shows at the end of the 19th century, people were already witnessing, like, what is going to happen to the death of the cowboy, to the death of the openness of the West, to the death of the frontier and the pioneer that at that point for almost 100 years defined American identity. It's the It's the Crockett's of the world. It's the Johnny Appleseeds. It's the cowboy. It's this pioneer. It's Lewis and Clark. This is the American hero. And he says, now that we've already gone all the way to the West Coast, now that we've already built railway all the way to California, what's going to happen to the American psyche? And he wonders and he argues that there may be ramifications to American identity with the loss of the frontier. So I bring all that up to highlight that all of this occurs in a very brief period, and the symbolism, the archetype of the cowboy has never really left America. And why I say then it's interesting that it's this resurgence is that I want to talk a little bit about what the cowboy represents as an archetype. Because I argue, I just started to sit and think, like, what are all the ways in which the cowboy can understand in archetypal words? Well, one, he's a warrior, right? What is the warrior archetype in America? Well, I think most people probably think of like a modern army soldier or a military soldier or Navy SEAL or something. But if you think historically, just like you think of England in the night, in America, you think the cowboy. He is a warrior in the sense that he is facing evil. He is facing dangers willingly. He is encountering the unknown and conquering. And also, he's like a shepherd, right? So think of a biblical archetype. The cowboy is also shepherd-like, a la sort of King David in his early days. He's the one that's steering the cattle. He is intimately in relationship with nature. He's intimately connected with the animals and husbandry. And so he's this interesting figure where he's both, I argue that the cowboy is unique because at this end of the 19th century, you have this view of the barbarian, a la the Native American, the tribesman. And then you have this idea of the domesticated man, the man in a three-piece suit, the man inside New York City, the man contributing to the economy and to this industry of America. The cowboy is neither one. And he's this liminal archetype where what differentiates him from the barbarian is his moral code. But what differentiates him from the domestic American man is his capacity for violence. And there is a idealization of this man who is both held by a moral code, but also is incredibly prone to the potentiality of violence and can enact that in any circumstance, whether it be through fistfights, gunfighting, all this type of stuff. And so the liminal figure of the cowboy in the historical context is he's occupying, again, this bridge between what Americans viewed as the Indian barber, or not Berber, but the barbarian, the Indian barbarian, and the 20th century man to become, the ideal of the American industry. And he's also, as I said, a sort of knight figure. He represents values. He represents loyalty. And he is the pioneer, right? So as Lewis and Clark hit the Pacific Ocean, they're not wearing their raccoon hats anymore. They're wearing cowboy hats. That the cowboy is the transition, or if you want to say the pioneer evolves into the American cowboy. And this is why we don't sort of idealize, coon hats and Johnny Appleseed the same way, because that imagery, those ideals are already fulfilled, what becomes the American cowboy. And something that I sat and thought about from an Orthodox perspective, I think you could say that the cowboy is an ascetic. The cowboy has a sort of American asceticism that as America, and especially you think of the 1950s with the abundancy and the post-World War II world and the hegemony, the unipolar world that America finds itself in, and then this idea of comfort and making life more and more comfortable and pleasurable. The cowboy was not interested. The cowboy was a sort of ascetic. I mean, he literally slept outside. He traveled for weeks, months. He had to hunt his own food. He had to fight off, Indians that wanted to kill or steal or whatever it may be. So he carried very little with him, only that which was necessary. And so in the American context, you can almost view him as a form of ascetic, a sort of nature ascetic, if you will. And then obviously the most iconic aspect of the cowboy is an archetype of freedom, an archetype of free masculinity, a man who is not held back by a boss or an overlord. The only thing that holds the cowboy back is his cattle contracts. You know, who is he moving cattle for? You know, what job is he taking for the next 3 or 4 months or the next season? That is the only thing that's holding him back. He works. He is a contractor. He's work for hire, and then he goes on with his life. And that idea, even in America, you know, it's reminiscent of the fact how many people move. You know, a major difference between Europeans and Americans is Europeans, the city that they're born in, the percentage of those that stay in that city is way higher. An American, in America, it's very common for us to be born in a city and then we go and we move to a different state, and then we maybe move to a different state, and then we maybe move and settle and build our family somewhere else. And it's part of this unique experience in America where we have really no place. There's not, identity is not equated with rootedness in the same way that it is in other places. And I would say part of that is influenced by this ideal of the cowboy. The cowboy is the quintessential American, and he's constantly on the move because the whole land, right? The whole territory is my home. And that's how a lot of people think of continental United States, is that, well, it's all home. And so I would say those aspects, those archetypes are one of the reasons why, and I'll get into some of the critiques, but also why the cowboy is reemerging itself. Like I just said, the TV shows, the country music, the aesthetic. When foreigners come to America, we're seeing this, just like the World Cup, the uptick in the purchasing of cowboy hats and cowboy boots. What is it? Well, one, for the European, and I was reading an article about Europeans and what they said about Texas, and they're like, oh, it's so cool. When I think of America, I think of the cowboy, I think of jeans, I think of, gunfighting. And so even in an international setting, the only archetype that is truly international of the American, that's historical. I'm not talking about the fat American slob that is ignorant of people's culture. That's certainly an archetype now too. But the historical archetype is still the cowboy. And so in the 21st century, where we have multiculturalism, we have religious pluralism, we have a literal devotion towards this idea of equity and diversity, the cowboy emerges, I would say, at an unconscious level for Americans as one, racial, which is interestingly enough, because as we've already highlighted with the history of what the cowboy is, it is essentially an Anglo-Germanic adoption of Spanish herding practices that get developed, as Jose has already said, for over 2,000 years. And in America, and this is why I think the archetype of the cowboy is even more American, is because America, unlike Germany, unlike England, unlike France, unlike Spain, we are born in a multicultural, multilinguistic world from the beginning of the Enlightenment experiment. Spain was here, France was here, Native Americans were here, African slaves were here. So America, the idea of like a racial purity of America, it's inconsistent with its own history. However, the white heritage American encountering the diversity of culture and then synthesizing that into its own identity is exactly what America does. And that is the cowboy.
Yep. And the thing about myths or mythos of a race, the closer that their founding myths or their fundamental myths that tell them who they are, where they come from, where they're going, what is the ideal, how do they live their life, how do they appease the gods, etc. The closer that myth is to true reality, the more effective that myth is. And that's part of why the cowboy is such an effective myth for the Americans, because the idea of, as you mentioned, cowboy is the American version of the knight. it holds because that reflects the reality of the origin of where the cowboy came from. As I mentioned before, the Reconquista, the vaqueros were the light cavalry of the various Christian kings who over 7 centuries, fought with the Muslims to complete the Reconquista.
Right.
So the same in the New World with the soldados de cuera. So with the actually, I wanted to go over too. The vaqueros were always a warrior class. So they were a warrior class, and they were forced to be a warrior class. And you have this theme throughout them of keeping the peace on the border, as well as this theme of reconquering that which has been lost. And so, given that many Americans are finding themselves, depending how you draw the line of what is heritage American, many are, especially young men, are feeling more and more like, truly, it is a true feeling, feeling pointing to truth that they're being heavily invaded, and they have a need to reconquer their nation. And that is what the function of the vaquero had in the Spanish medieval Reconquista period. And in the case of, because this relates to the American War of Independence even, in the case of the soldados de cuera, like their gear, as I mentioned before, is the same as the vaquero, in particular the vaqueros tejanos, the charros. In their case, they're remuda, which remuda in Espanol, and in English, remuda. Remuda is your personal stable. So Soldado de Cuera was required to have, in his remuda, he had to have 6 war horses, 1 mule, and 1 colt. The mule for carrying the stuff that you needed to carry, but 6 war horses. That indicates how much combat these men were doing on horseback, in the need to have a fresh mount across the entire area from the Rio Grande all the way up to Montana. Now Montana, back then Montana. So in the case of the soldados de cuera, they drew not just on the as I mentioned before, the Tejano Vaquero population, but they even down the line, especially after Spanish Louisiana became a thing, they started even incorporating some of the Cajun into their numbers. And as well as even before Spanish Louisiana became a thing, they started absorbing the many divisions of these soldados de cuera hosts. Took in freed slaves who had runaway slaves from the French side of the border along the Mississippi River. So in terms of weaponry, like the standard weaponry for these men, so they have a musket, they would have a brace of pistols. Revolvers weren't a thing yet, so you would have 6 to 12 pistols loaded on your person. And of course the saber. You had to be trained. They had to train in the saber. Which was essentially your standard sidearm for when you were out of gunpowder. And then, of course, the lance, the specific lance that they used for the soldados de cuera, it originates from the garrocha, except it definitely cannot be used for herding cattle. It was very much purpose-built weapon of war. So originally, as I mentioned before, set up by King Philip II, copying the Russian Cossack hosts that guarded Russia's open steppe. Philip V standardized training across all the units from California to Texas, and even standardized the training in regards to like the bull riding, the original rodeo bull riding that the charros had developed, and also standardized the gear and dress. If you look at the old sketches that were preserved through time, the uniforms that we know very well, and my wife plans on making one for our son for a future Halloween. Those are from the era of Charles III. He was very much, he wanted his troops to be fashionable. So the most fashionable uniform of the soldados de cuera were definitely from his era. And those are the ones that if you Google soldados de cuera, that's what will pop up, the Charles III era uniforms. So this is where the American Independence War gets involved. So one thing that confused me as a kid, and I know I've mentioned this in a past open panel before, what confused me as a kid is why didn't the British Army, who was state of the art at the time, why didn't they not simply concentrate their forces and crush the Continental Army? And that was something that always it ate at me as a kid back in grade school. And then when I settled where I settled and going into the history, I discover that George Washington actually credited a father of Texas, Bernardo del Galvez, for why the British couldn't do that. So Bernardo del Galvez, he led the Soldados de Cuera for a time in the Apache Wars. The Apache being probably the most warlike tribe that the Spanish had the most trouble with. So he led the New World Spanish troops during the American Independence War from San Luis, which is now St. Louis, to Pensacola, Florida. And during that time, Governor of Texas, Domingo Cabello y Robles, he supplied Galvez with meat in handy leather bags with 4 legs that happened to move themselves. So these giant cattle trains to supply the army. This is the power of cattle, and this is also part of how the Spanish won the Reconquista. When you can move your food supply away from the Muslims when they come,
Right.
and keep it with your armies, that's a huge advantage over crops that you can't just dig them out of the ground and move them elsewhere, transplant them easily.
Right.
Interestingly enough, there was a Frenchman who had Hispanicized, Teodoro de la Croix, who led this cattle supply logistics effort. So born in France, and specifically he was a Fleming. He volunteered for the Spanish army at 17, and he fully Hispanicized. His nickname was El Flamenco, which the Fleming. The cattle that was supplied for this army mostly came from the Spanish Catholic missions throughout Texas. They gathered from the Presidio La Bahia and the Vaqueros Tejanos, who worked that cattle drive, trailed the herd through Nacatoches, Natitoches, and Opelousas. And they also supplied war horses this way as well, to supply this essentially this army that was overwhelmingly Spanish Cajun, Tejano, and as well as German, because you had New German. And what I refer to as the New Germans, they existed before America annexed that territory.
Right.
You had this portion of the Mississippi that was referred to as the German coast because it was settled by Germans, and it was German speaking. Bernardo de Galvez was super popular when he was governor of Spanish Louisiana. That's why Spanish Louisiana did Hispanify, and the Cajun did adopt a lot of Spanish stuff. That's why, for example, so most people know about salsa, but there's a Cajun equivalent, Zydeco, which is very, very similar, different. It has a very more French African flavor to it, but it's a dance in the same manner as salsa, but just different flavor, and that arose at the same time. In the Cajuns adopted Spanish wear, like the women of New Orleans intentionally adopted Spanish wear because Bernardo Galvez was such a popular governor that they started adopting Spanish fashion instead of French fashion, which was the predominant before. So this army that Galvez built from scratch, and that was supplied via food that was run by Tejano Vaqueros. Those Vaqueros Tejanos, they also had to fight. They were armed and they fought as well, even though they were not primarily warriors, because the British, of course, trying to stop this army that was wreaking havoc for them from the Missouri River all the way to Florida, and throughout the western part of the war, which is, at least in my upbringing, was wholly ignored in my elementary and middle and high school American history studies. The British obviously wanted to stop that, and the best way to stop an army is you target the logistics. And the way the British did that is they organized the tribes which were loyal to the British, or in some who were even also mercenaries the British hired, and to attack the cattle drive. So the Vaqueros Tejanos who worked that route had to fight off multiple tribes that were organized by British officers, as well as the Comanche and the Lipan Apache, who were warring against each other at the time. And on occasion, they would be fighting an area over where the cattle were going through, and both of them would want to get that cattle. So I know that, interestingly enough, the Tejanos also raised up. This is the crazy part. I didn't even know this until recently. They raised up more than 1,600 pesos of silver, like weights of silver, so actual Spanish ounces of silver,
right,
to fund the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse that forced the British to surrender at Yorktown in 1781. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so that final naval blockade that forced the British surrender was wholly funded by Tejanos.
Interesting.
So this is where things get crazy. Well,
let me say something. When you were talking about some of the European connections with all the Tejanos and the cowboy culture, reminiscent to the fact that I was talking about the ancient or the European knight, what immediately came to mind is that the American cowboy is a sort of democratization of the knight.
Yes.
Right. So you're talking about all this European history, and notice that it keeps going back to monarchy. Mm-hmm. And Europe has these ancient cities. It has castles. But what America had was a frontier. And what does a frontier represent? It represents like a movement towards the new, the unknown, exploration. And we mentioned this before, that if you look at like John Winthrop and some of the early Protestant ministers that came to America, the whole Puritan ideal of the shining city on a hill is that America was the end point of history. That the American man, by the time of the Revolution, was seeing that what the American project was going to be is somebody who is emancipated from the context of history itself.
Hmm.
And and so I was thinking about this while you were speaking, is you're connecting all this European history, and I think, wow, it's so interesting that the cowboy is a sort of democratization of the knight. He has no castle, he has no title, he has no lineage. Um, his only, and this is where it gets into individualism, both good and bad. What the cowboy has is his reputation and his skill set.
Hmm.
That's the only thing he has. Um, and so I don't know. I just thought that that was an interesting connection with this transition, and that the two, in regards to the barbed wire and the sort of ending of the cowboy era, which you could say the golden age of the cowboy is almost 20 years old, like
Hmm.
20 years long is my point. And that is the blink of an eye. Like, that's what's so really amazing about the archetype of the cowboy, is when we compare it to Europe, they have thousands, at least hundreds of years of archetype. The knight is an entire medieval period warrior.
Yep.
Our mythology, our hero archetype emerges from a 20-year transitional period where America is moving from the sort of Civil War era to the 20th century, to electricity, to major cities, to cars, to everything that we now, when you think of what's American, you think of big space, big vehicles, technology. That is, the cowboy represents this transitionary period. And I said he's sort of a liminal figure, but he's also, because he's that liminal figure, he's the guardian of boundaries. And in that 20-year period where there was no boundaries, he was the boundary. And what I mean by is outlaws, cattle barons, bandits, threats to a town, or as I said, the corrupt sheriff. That the cowboy is that which establishes the boundaries, which is masculinity. I've talked
Hmm.
about this over again, is that masculinity is that which defines cultural boundaries. That's why men go to war. And the fact that we have no culture is indicative that the men have nothing to fight for or stand for. That men are not traditional. They don't have a shared canopy, a shared value system to defend. And the cowboy is so interesting because he really is this boundary figure in a place that has no boundaries. And once the boundaries of states, of private property emerges, the cowboy disappears in history.
Hmm. Yeah, and this applies. There's actually two things I drew from that apply to things we talked about last week. So one, to the question of like, how does a man save for post collapse or save for the future? The reality is, you live in an invaded empire that's heavily invaded and degrading. It is very similar to the end of the Visigothic kingdom that existed in Spain. Many a landless horseman took up work as a vaquero. Their numbers swelled during that time. That's what you can always carry with you, and what you won't lose, till your old age, are skills. And those are things that you always be able to pass down to your children and grandchildren before you lose them to old age. So the skills are the real savings for a man who doesn't have anything.
Yes.
And that's the history of the vaquero all the way back to the beginning. It was a man who had either lost everything and joined up in this way of life so that he could feed his own, and learn the skills in order to get good at it.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the issue, this also relates to, again, the issue of a myth is more effective the more true, more is aligned with reality.
Right.
So the mythos of the American cowboy is so strong because, as I just described, the vaqueros themselves played a huge role in the birth of America as an independent nation from Britain. The fact that these working vaqueros literally fundraised to get the French fleet to blockade Yorktown. The fact that they were using their cattle drive skills and their fighting skills to fight with the natives that were allied to the British and supply food, that made it all the way to the East Coast, and using their skills for that purpose. And this is one of the very interesting things. So America, sure, you had especially post-Reconstruction, you had segregation, But what's very unique about the U.S., there are two things. I want to get to that point. I'll get right to that point because it builds from this other one. But I just wanted to point out, so Galvez is an interesting character in that. So he did a lot to serve the American nation in its birth, and in organizing the Tejanos and the Cajuns into a fully functioning, at that time, modern army. He was honored by the Continental Congress on October 31 of 1778, and he was granted posthumous honorary American citizenship. I think he was like the 8th person to receive that ever on December 16, 2014. And it was essentially because of Galvez's strategy and his actions that the British were not able to simply focus their energy on Washington and wipe him out. And they had to contend the entire frontier, that massive frontier from St. Louis all the way to Pensacola. And Galvez gave them no rest. And he himself personally led the army into battle. He's a, when you're talking about mythos of an ethnos, so Washington, George Washington, John Hancock, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, etc. Like these are part of the mythos of what makes an American American, of a heritage American. Galvez is very much part of that mythos for a Tejano, because one, he is both a son and a father of Texas. Like he was born in Andalusia, but this is where he came, this is where he settled, this is where he put his effort in, guarded the border, adopted much of the vaquero way of life, even as he was a wealthy commander. So it's he's someone that of course I have his biography, but my kid, he's going to be a critical part of the mythos that I want to hand down to my children. Right. So, and that's part of why what I talk about. So you mentioned how Americans see all the land as place for them to dwell. This is true. The downside is that attitude does tend to degrade the strength of local folk culture. Right. I know townie was an insult.
And identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say that's part of what because I have a whole list of critiques of the cowboy as well, because I don't want to just glaze the cowboy. That's not the point. The point is to honestly assess it. And I think it's such a useful archetype because you can see both the virtues of America and how in ways those virtues are negatives of America. Now, what the cowboy represents is someone that is saying that you can construct yourself, right? So many cowboys were actually fleeing potential crime, potential baggage out east, and they're looking for a new start. Very American, the idea that you can go just move somewhere and construct yourself. You can choose your new identity. Someone that is constantly expressing themselves unhindered, that you could discover yourself out in a journey, right? How many people when they're young or in their 20s, they go travel or they move somewhere else in the US to go discover themselves or reinvent themselves? In ways, the cowboy is someone who represents the ideal of what the Americans were trying to do. Now, at the same time, that individualism and that lack of identity and that lack of stasis in a local community is part of the identity problem. This is the irony of the cowboy, is that people, I argue right now, the reason why country music is so popular and cowboy aesthetics is so popular is that it galvanizes people back under a sacred canopy. That split in heroic myths and values and patriotism. Well, if you're wearing a cowboy hat 9 times out of 10, I can already tell that you're probably more conservative, that you probably, there's value systems that go along with the aesthetic. And that the fact that identity is reviving itself is an identity that itself has the problems of identity, right? The cowboy and his nomadic ways and his individualism is part of the problem of identity crisis in America. And yet in the face of identity crisis, Americans are fleeing back to the archetype of the cowboy to sort of rescue something that's been lost.
And that's something I wanted to touch, because someone asked that question in the live stream comments, which was it was the cowboy, the OG Sigma, and that's actually part of the corruption of the vaquero that occurred with the dime novels back in the 60s. Because if you look at the vaquero way of life, or if you're looking at the gauchos of Argentina or the charros of Texas, you didn't go anywhere on your own. It was not a lone wolf style lifestyle. Like you traveled with your group, with your people, and you were not a lone man. And that's something that you see in the dime novels. is
Yeah.
how the life is portrayed. It's the lone wolf Sigma who comes
Yes.
in and restores things to being right.
Yes.
There are two things at play there. One, because the Civil War happened, a lot of things went wrong and society was messed up from a lot of people's
Right.
perspective, not just the South, but
You could
even
say
in the
the
North.
sacred canopy was split then too,
Correct.
right? So America, you had the Union, you had the Yankees, you had the South, and you had so many Southern soldiers. I mean, a lot of the cowboys were Southern soldiers during the Civil War. And
Hmm.
this is why you get, even in cowboys, the Wild West, you get so many African Americans. I mean, not so many in the sense that it's overabundant, but compared to other aspects, because slaves or slaves that fought in the Civil War saw this as an opportunity to emancipate themselves and gain some type of autonomy and freedom. And so the Wild West, it was exactly that. It was a point in which the sacred canopy of and think how quickly it split. I mean, 1776 is the revolution. By 1860s, the canopy's already split, and we have a civil war. And then the cowboy emerges until this point in which, in a sense, the sort of canopy reconvenes itself by the beginning of the 20th century.
Hmm. And to put a positive spin on it, I personally see the dime novels depiction of the cowboy as a Sigma or Sigma, sociosexual hierarchical behavioral pattern.
Mm,
Part of that is the desire for a judge to come and make things right.
yeah.
And that's something you see recurring through that, and you can see this the alpha version of it in Lord of the Rings, not the movie. So because that's actually the one thing one of the things I don't like about the movie. I mean, Viggo Mortensen's portrayal of Aragorn was very, very Sigma. He's a man not looking for power. He's not looking, he's running away from his birthright. Yet, the ladies still like him, and he's still very masculine. And he's also a lone wolf in the movies.
Right.
And it may have been for budget concerns, but like in the books, and it's interesting because I've actually a while ago I did a survey. It's not like not sufficient to be statistically significant, but I surveyed 30 women I knew in terms of like what were the men they found the most attractive in fiction. And interestingly enough, one of the top one was explicitly book Aragorn, because book Aragorn is not a Sigma. He is alpha as alpha can be. Like literally from the beginning, you meet him in the Fellowship of the Ring. He's a man who's used to being in charge, expects people to follow his orders, expects to take on responsibility for the entire group. Essentially, he's born to be king. He knows he's born to be king, and he wants to be king, and he's looking for that crown. And he's not a lone wolf in the wilderness like he's portrayed in the movie at all. He has multiple cousins in the book who travel with him in a war band. And even when he fell for Arwen, he was 17 years old. And Elrond, of course, being the protective father, has his two sons. One, he sends Aragorn away into the wilderness to get him away from his daughter. He's like, yeah, no, this is not going to happen. And he sends his two sons to make sure Aragorn doesn't get anywhere near his daughter. And through this process over a few decades of fighting, orcs and evil and the remnants of the Witch King of Angmar, or like of the various orc bands up there, and other adventures, both of Elrond's sons become fast friends with Aragorn and follow him around, bravos to an alpha. And it actually irritates Elrond a bit that his own sons are like following this guy like Aragorn is their king. So that's what I mean by like book Aragorn super alpha. And it would be interesting to see the take of an American cowboy story where instead of a Sigma, it's an alpha like character like Aragorn, who's not lone wolfing it, bringing chaos into order, but rather leading a war band. Essentially, that's what the Dunedain were, leading a war band of vaqueros and cowboys, etc. And you can even have it like in this story be a mixture of like Scotch Irish Anglo-Saxons and Tejanos and even some Christian natives forming to bring order to a given place that's experiencing some kind of chaos. There'll be something I think it'll be like that is actually what I see as the potential for an American Lord of the Rings right there.
Yeah.
And that's
you're so right. And that Sigma dimension is so American because it's the built-in individualism of America, of the American ideal, right? The self-made man. And the cowboy is that outside of economic purposes, right? Because it's like by the 20th century, the self-made man is a man who makes money, is a man of wealth, is a man of financial success. But after the Civil War, the self-made man is a man of skills, is a man of self-direction, is a man of self-sufficiency. and it very much is Sigma. And that individualism, I think, is it. And I want to answer some questions from the audience, but I want to get more into some of the critiques, because that individualism is both a benefit in the sense that it creates a stirring in individual men or women, but mostly men, to become something. That there is the process of being in which you can, through intention and effort, become something more than you are. But also it leads into pride. And this is the problem with the American, right? So it's like the virtues of the cowboy can also be seen as taken to the extreme, which I think they are in many ways the problem with aspects of American society. So I want to continue that, and I want to read something to you about civil religion, because I thought that'd be a really important aspect, since we're talking about an archetype, an American archetype. I wanted to bring up just a paragraph from Robert Bellah. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. He's a famous sociologist that wrote on the sociology of religion. And he has a book from 1967 that's very famous for academics called The Civil Religion in America, in which he describes what the religion and what the God of America is. And there's this paragraph I want to read in which he highlights the God of American civil religion is not necessarily the God of Christianity, though Christianity has informed the civil religion of America. And so there's a very interesting paragraph that he wrote in 1967 that I thought is totally timeless and applicable to today. So we'll get to that in just a second. But shout out to Wretched Man of God. Throws in 20, says, we got to bring back cool hats, especially cowboy hats, and not the cheap factory produced ones. Yeah, agreed. Thank you very much, Wretched Man of God, for the support. God bless you. Cactus Rancher throws in 5. Oh, sounds like a parishioner.
Yes.
Many years, Jose. See you Sunday. Much love, brother.
Love back to you. And hopefully I see you at Vigil too, unless you're working.
Oh, nice. Well, shout out to Cactus Rancher. And welcome Martin Burkhan to becoming the latest Total Crew member. God bless you, brother. Physique's looking good in the profile pic. Keep it up. And then To the Chickens throws in 10. Thank you very much. Says, question. Does a super El Nino off the West Coast that causes mass crop failure and famine also because of combined fertilizer loss due to the wars count as fulfilling prophecy? Okay, I thought this was going to be a cowboy question. Yes, it could. I mean, the saints don't speak specifically on what causes the famine or the crisis. All of those things are contributing to it, no doubt. And on Dono Chat, Mark T throws in $5, says, stopped listening to Marty Robbins and Johnny Cash to watch this. Thanks for the stream, Doc. Well, shout out to you, Mark T. And Straight Outta In's Mouth says, always stoked to catch a stream with you chopping it up with Jose. Take the money. Throws in $5. Thank you very much. And our brother Lockstep, XX Lockstep, threw in 5, says, great topic. I'm something of a cowboy myself. So if anybody has any questions regarding, again, this, I feel like so far this conversation really doesn't exist on YouTube. This is, I mean, the history that you've provided, I think the analysis of a cowboy as a mythic figure in the American imagination is something that's underappreciated. But go ahead. If you have something to say, go ahead.
Oh, because there was a question in the chat. All this talk of vaquero, but no mention of Zorro. Yeah. And the thing is, because Zorro's he's not a cowboy at all. He was an aristocrat. So he was a landed aristocrat. He was a man born to rule in California. There are two men that the Zorro character is essentially a combination of. There's a thread, a historical thread. People argue is this Irishman that inspired Zorro, but he himself was a Mason who was just really corrupt. Anyway, that's a whole different story. But I don't want to start at that argument. But Zorro is very much the archetype of the landed aristocrat who's navigating a time where things are changing, where you have the Boston period of California, where you have a foreign elite who are changing things and becoming more and more influential. And how do you, as an old landed aristocrat, navigate and fight the evil that results from this business activity? Frankly, Yankee business activity. That's the archetype of Zorro. Which is also partially why it endures, not because we have landed aristocrats today, But there is an element of Zorro that's very anti-Yankee that I think, made him a bit popular in the South in the dime novel era.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think more Americans need to learn American history. I think just history in general. We say this all the time, but guys, history is fucking badass, dude. It's like I love learning and reading about history, and it gives you such a perspective on contemporary items happening in society. I always say, like, how can you see the pattern if you don't know the historical continuity?
Exactly. And if we do succeed in getting a orthodox oligarchic power structure within Texas, I will be pushing, and I expect all the listeners to support me in restoring old school, the traditional rodeo. So,
Yeah. Well, you're first, buddy. I want to see you put the saddle on the bull.
exactly. That's the thing. I don't even know how they did it. I'm just reading descriptions by eyewitnesses from the 18th century, and I'm like, holy cow. And
No, that was fascinating. And it makes total sense because it's the full one, it's a pragmatic reason for bull riding. That makes total sense. Like when you see the whole the breaking of the bull, like, yeah, that makes total sense. And that we just now do a very minor portion,
Mm-hmm.
The Bombasticus throws in 5 says, I really hate that the view of Americans as a society and individuals is that they are prideful and greedy, but people really like to feed that view. Well, Bombasticus, you make a good point. I say one of the things I think is so easy to do for Orthodox converts is to just constantly bash America. And there's plenty to bash, but I think we need to also appreciate. I was talking to this, I was speaking about this to actually clergy, and you really can't be Orthodox and not be patriotic.
Mm-hmm.
And Saint Nicholas of Japan, when he had his parish in the Russo-Japanese War broke out, he had parishioners that were Japanese, and they came to him and said, Father, we're Orthodox Christians. We belong to a Russian Orthodox church. Is it sinful for me to pray for the Japanese? Because in my heart, I want the Japanese to win this war. And he said, no, not at all. That is your historical providence by God. You pray for the Japanese, and I, as a Russian, will pray for the Russians. And whatever may happen, happens. And that's God's will. And so he told his parishioners to pray for the Japanese military, which ended up winning. It was a humiliating loss for Tsar Nicholas. Tarnished his reputation, especially then leading into World War I. But anyways, the point is we as American Orthodox Christians shouldn't see Orthodoxy as an escaping of America. We really need to do the historical Cyril and Methodius sanctification of America and be honest about also the good things and the positives. I mean, it's easy to be overwhelmed with the negatives, but we also are privileged. And we have cool history, and it's God's providence for anybody here that's living in the United States. That's your providence. And you have to make with it what you will, and you have to find patriotism and connecting yourself back to the tradition of your fathers that came before.
It's part of the honor your father and mother this is the first commandment with a promise that you may have long life. That's what patriotism is, like patria, father. It's loyalty to one's fathers, to one's ancestors. Right. And that's I do have an article coming out on that in terms of my case against nationalism, like the ideology, because nationalism turns the relationship into something that's horizontal, whereas patriotism is vertical through time. It's the loyalty to one's fathers.
That's a great delineation. Yeah.
Yep. So I won't spoil that, but that'll be coming out at some point in the next 2 weeks. And it's something I want to build out more because we are seeing a rise in nationalism again as a reaction to globalism. But the fact is, nationalism is what paved way. Enlightenment nationalism is what paved the way for globalism.
Right. That's what I always tell people. Like, oh no, I'm not a modernist. I'm a nationalist. It's like, well, guy, nationalism is part of post-Enlightenment modernity. I don't care if you're fascist, you're Marxist, you're nationalist, you're socialist, you're capitalist. All of these are ideologies coming out of the problem. Like it's the fork in the road where we as a civilization made the wrong turn and forfeited, our heritage with Christian metaphysics, tradition, all this different, and patriarchy. And to your point, Jose, it's so apropos because modernity is threatened by patriarchy and hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And so to your point, patriotism is a recognition of hierarchy. And nationalism as a modernist ideology is a flattening of that hierarchy, really, where there's the flattening and then there's the rulers.
Yep.
But there is no gradation.
We got just over a minute to get that super chat goal. So people got to start paying out.
Reset it.
If you want to see me next week, if you want me to spend time doing research on stuff like this, and if you want to learn stuff, I'm just saying, let's hit that.
Yeah. Thank you. Deep throws in $2, says, I'm literally Clint Eastwood. Excellent. And guys, before we go into the next section and continue our conversation, everyone go subscribe to Jose's Substack. The link is in the video description. I'm going to share it right now in the chat, and I'm going to share his Buy Me a Coffee link as well. So support our brother Jose for the time he puts in. And again, if you like these free-flowing conversations, because Jose and I didn't even correlate. We just set a topic, and then we met, and I knew that he would have an angle that'd be different from my angle, and they go together perfect. And if you love the depth, the historical depth, the insights of Jose, go subscribe to what I just shared in the live chat, his Substack. And if you want to support his work, go support him through Buy Me a Coffee. I just shared that link in the chat. So show our brother some love, because it takes time. I spent time prepping. I knew a little bit about it, but just sitting and thinking and try to get your thoughts in order, it takes time. And so we appreciate anybody who's willing to subscribe to our Substack, subscribe to our channels, and support us financially. God bless you all. Thank you very much. So let me go to the next thing that I wanted to discuss with you and kind of branch into the continuation of this conversation is American civil religion. So again, in prep for today, I was just doing research. You can see I had the billboard. I was just curious myself. But I found a online version of a section from Civil Religion in America. Again, this is an article by Robert Bellah from a journal in 1967. And if you scroll down here, this was something I found incredibly fascinating, and I wanted to share with you guys. Where was it? I think I just scrolled by it. Let me see. Israel is in it. Here we go. Okay. So this is from 1967. Okay. Tell me if this does not describe America today. And so the idea here is that societies have a sort of civil religion. The civil religion is not necessarily transcendent. It's not ultimately about pointing to theology or dogmas or God. It is the civil religion, the civil mythos that defines a group of people. And here, this paragraph right here, I think is excellent in defining the civil religion of America. And so Robert Bellah, famous sociologist, says this: the words and acts of the founding fathers, especially the first few presidents, shaped the form and tone of the civil religion as it has been maintained ever since. Though much is selectively derived from Christianity, this religion is clearly not itself Christianity. For one thing, neither Washington nor Adams nor Jefferson mentions Christ in his inaugural address. And mind you, Robert Bellah was Episcopalian. Okay, so, and it was before the LGBTQ Episcopalian, ministers and stuff. He was Christian. So I doubt he would be in favor of what's going on now. But he says Washington nor Adams nor Jefferson mentions Christ in his inaugural address, nor do any of the subsequent presidents, although not one of them fails to mention God. So interesting. Our founding fathers mentioned God, but not Christ. The God of the civil religion is not only rather Unitarian, he is also on the austere side, much more related to order, law, and right than to salvation and love. Even though he is somewhat deist in cast, he is by no means simply a watchmaker God. He is actively interested and involved in history with a special concern for America. Here, the analogy has much less to do with natural law than that of ancient Israel. The equation of America with Israel is the idea of the American Israel. It is not infrequent. What was implicit in the words of Washington already quoted becomes explicit in Jefferson's second inaugural when he said, I shall need to the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old, from their native land and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life. Europe is Egypt. America, the promised land, God has led his people to establish a new sort of social order that shall be a light unto the nations. So I thought that was a really interesting aspect, because whether you look at modern evangelical Zionism and dispensational theology, there is this Israeli or Israel, I won't say Israeli because I think of the state of Israel, but this Old Testament Israel connection with America. And I just bring that up because when we're talking about the archetype of the cowboy, we're really talking about the civil religion. And the cowboy, in a sense, is a saint. He is a worker in the civil religion. He is a conduit of the civil religion, just like the founding fathers are very much in the pantheon of the civil religion. They are sort of minor deities. And so, yeah, I just thought that was, what are your thoughts on that? I thought that was an interesting, again, and very poignant perception from like the 1960s about America.
Mm-hmm. Well, religion being the ties that bind, any society that exists is going to have ties that bind, and that would be its religion. And the U.S. is unique in that respect, that it was a very huge departure from what existed before in what people would refer to as Christendom. So I know, for example, in the same place where John Jay mentions that part of the American system of government is for the Christians to be able to choose their own leadership and fully express their freedom of conscience. He literally does say that America is there to preserve essentially the right to heresy and right to apostatize. That's the individualism bug there at the beginning. The idea that religion is a personal matter alone, and not one that applies to, or the Christianity is a personal matter that doesn't apply to the whole entire economic sphere. And by economic, I mean like real space sphere, right. Space and time where people actually live out their lives. It's interesting too, because in that idea that the Republic was set up for Christians to be able to choose their own rulers. I mean, you look at George Washington. I don't have the argument laid out here, but I will do it for a future article. But his own pastor said that his God wasn't Jesus Christ; it was reason. Right. And in the case of John Adams, he was a Unitarian who denied the divinity of Jesus Christ. Thomas Jefferson, literally edited the Bible and also denied,
right. He was a better Bible reader.
Yep. You don't get a man who can be considered loosely Christian until it's John Quincy Adams. And I do have a series I'm working on for the founding fathers, and I don't want to throw the whole Adams family under the bus. But John Quincy Adams was genuinely, at least from what I can see, was a good man, and was trying to worship the truth as he understood it. And there wasn't. So it's just he had a whole lot of relatives who were crazy, especially Sam Adams. So that's which I do have stuff coming out on that guy in the future. This is the crazy thing. You look at the U.S. government, and there was I forget which Episcopalian minister it was. I have written down somewhere, but he wrote about how he was surprised how, and this is after the U.S. Constitution was established. He said, "How is it that we, a Christian people, are ruled by non-Christians?" And he was just asking that question, and that's the thing. The Constitution itself was the U.S. War of Independence was a revolution. You have a ruling class that isn't Christian ruling over a population that is a variety of flavors of nonconformist Protestantism, from the Congregational Puritans to the Presbyterians, especially in like Scotch-Irish Appalachia, to the Episcopalians among the old money, especially in Tidewater, and of course the Dutch Reformed in New York, and at the time, and especially in the late 18th century, you have the rise of actual Unitarianism in the cities of New England, as well as Universalism in the rural areas of New England, which eventually would join forces and become the Unitarian Universalists that today almost don't exist anymore because they're dying out. But they used to be a super powerful force in the 19th century.
But the paradigm is still totally it has totally infiltrated American religion, right? Mm-hmm. So perennialism, ecumenism.
Yep.
The idea, the idea that we can bring Somalis and Hindus to America and they contribute to the fabric of America. Well, what is that? That's because the civil God of our American civil religion is not Christ. It's a Unitarian God over all religions. In many ways, the God of the American civil religion is is the Antichrist. It's the God where everything blends together. And I don't say that in a way to diminish what the Enlightenment Project of America was trying to do, because it would have been hard for, when I think of Jefferson, I'm thinking of a mid 20-year-old guy that's incredibly smart, incredibly learned, could read Greek and Latin, and he's in America. So you have to put these men in their context that they really can't see forward, or let's say they can't see beyond the Enlightenment and the consequences that we can now look back on and say, oh God, that was a terrible error in civilizational turns. But for them, they're caught up in this new excitement, this new energy that's taken over all of Europe. And then you're residing in an unknown territory and you're building a country, and then you defeat the best and strongest military in the world. It's hard to fully grok these men, and because it's very easy to criticize them as deists and Masons and red letter Bible readers, which they all were. But at the same time, you look at the historical context, and they are interesting men. They're men of competence. I mean, look at the founding fathers. They are competent men. That could the collection of 20-year-old Gen Zers do what the founding fathers did? I mean, many of those guys were in their 20s or early 30s.
Yeah. And that's the other thing too, because men were expected to be men at 12.
Yeah.
So you have a lot more development happening much earlier in one's life. You look at Benjamin Franklin, like, sure, card-carrying member of the Hellfire Club, but very effective at what he does. Now, I mean, his spiritual and life choices resulted in his son hating him to the point where his son volunteered for the British during the Revolutionary War. And that was actually a big giant.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, and also I'll put it this way. His son did not permit Benjamin Franklin to see his grandkids until he could no longer physically get his member up. Like his son.
What?
And it's officially, no one really knows why he wouldn't let his children around his father before that. But the sheer, like, Benjamin Franklin did not have a good relationship with his children. Like there's a lot of darkness there. I mean, besides the whole children buried in Benjamin Franklin's house, but there's anyway. That's what I mean. Like, yeah, it's you run the gamut. You have very men who have a lot of spiritual darkness all around them, like Benjamin Franklin and Sam Adams. You have men who are very talented, trying to do the best they could do, who are misguided and under certain levels of delusion, but still very competent and effective. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams. And you have men who are generally trying to do what they consider to be the right thing. George Washington. You span the whole gamut of people. That's the thing about any given people group. I mean, if you're speaking like in terms of Orthodox terms, like, yes, it's all was outside of Christianity. It's not really Christian per se, but every man was trying to do. Unfortunately, it's kind of like the last line in Judges. Every man is doing what is right in his own eyes.
Right.
And there was no king in Israel in that land. And that's kind of the consequence.
That is America.
Yeah.
Well, and that's perfect bridge to like Orthodox criticisms of the cowboy, and how the cowboy, because there is virtue. And to me, is the whole point of Jose Do It is that it is a valuable historical archetype and symbol. And I think it deserves the renaissance that is happening, and it makes sense in the cultural context that it's occurring in. But I think the cowboy is also an interesting foil to look at the problems of American identity and America itself. Number one being radical individualism. Like the cowboy is a radical individual, and he takes self-sufficiency to an extreme. He says, I don't need anybody else. But Orthodoxy says, isolation is of the devil, diabolos, and that human beings were created to be in communion. And this is the point that you were talking about, the difference between Aragon in the book version versus the movie version, is that an alpha male recognizes his power does not come from his isolation sigma, skill set. It comes from his leadership of galvanizing communities together to follow him. That is very Christian. Mm-hmm. And we take back the knight archetype, or the Knights of the Round Table, and Arthur, the mythology of King Arthur, like that is about a collectivity. Notice that it's subtle, but it's actually a massive difference on the understanding of individualism versus communal success.
Mhm.
And the American, because of this radical self-sufficiency and individualism, the cowboy is one that says, I don't need a king. I don't need the government. I don't need a community. I may not even need a family, right? Look even at Western movies about the romantic cowboy that is desired by the women, and then he has a fling or gets her pregnant, and sorry, he's got to go off. He's got to go on to the next cattle drive. He's got to leave. So there's no true it's not about a communal family construction. It's about the masculine, rugged masculinity of the individual.
Mhm. That's the Enlightenment corruption of the lifestyle of a vaquero, because when you look at the vaquero way of life across all these various groups, like especially during the Reconquista period, as I mentioned before, like the vaquero's life was one of community, migrating community, but still within your group. You didn't just run off and do your own thing. Even in terms of family formation, like if you fathered 7 sons with the same woman in wedlock, you were automatically made an hidalgo by the king, lower nobility. And so that was a way for a poor horseman, materially poor horseman, to enter into the aristocracy. And that method was through family formation, family life. And if you rolled the dice and you got 7 sons, who could be soldiers for the king's army, so against the Muslims.
Yeah.
So it's funny because when you think about upward mobility, so in America, like the upward mobility thing is usually, it's very Yankee in the sense of it's very much focused around money, productivity, something that's reflective of Calvinist societies like the Dutch Reformed, for example. Whereas in the Spanish tradition, like upward mobility was built around how well do you run your family? Do you have one wife? And did you produce lots and lots of babies with her? In particular, men for the king's army. Right. So yeah, it's just interesting, that comparison. And that's why I say, like, there's a lot of good things that carried over from the vaquero to the American cowboy, but there are some critical things that are missing. And it's that the lack of communal life and the lack of rootedness is part of it. Because even if you're looking at like the vaquero way of life, the charros, the huasos, the gauchos, the llaneros, they're all rooted to a specific spot. Like even the llaneros, their name is from that specific area, and they have a locale that they're tied to. Right. It's not like I'm going to go over to Peru and or to Brazil or wherever and just be the lone cowhand. It's right. But yeah, that's the thing. It's in terms of thinking of the idea of like this, the Sigma Cowboy also is very influenced by Clint Eastwood films, because Clint Eastwood tends to play his character.
And that's what Constantine, we're delineating. We're talking about the mythological figure of the cowboy. Of course, cowboys had families. Of course, we're not talking about every single man who was a cattle driver was a lone ranger who had no family. That's not what we're saying. The ideal of the cowboy, the Hollywood archetype of the cowboy is that. And that's what we're talking about, the Sigma. And I would say shows like Yellowstone, which is about a family empire, if you will. Yeah, of course. That's family oriented and stuff like that. So, yeah, we're not trying to say that no cowboys had families or were monogamous with women and bore children and protect. Of course, some of them did. But that brief 20-year period where the cowboy really existed, I mean, that's what was idealized about, is that he was not attached to anything. He was free to roam, that he answers to no man. He's not rooted in one place. And that's what we're saying is very much of this Sigma archetype. So both things can be true at the same time. So it's a fair criticism. He says they were driven into the position of being survivors by their circle. Oh, of course.
Oh, yeah. And that's true of the original vaqueros. That's very true of the original vaqueros, especially in the wake of the Islamic conquests. That's how that way of life became solidified in Spanish identity. And also the tradition, the Spanish tradition of light cavalry troops, or light cavalry for their armies, whereas France depended on their heavy cav, and the Holy Roman Empire as well, very heavy cav, heavy infantry focused. The Spanish were different in that because they adopted from, unlike Byzantium, unlike the Holy Roman Empire, they adopted from the Arab conquest and the Berbers, and they synthesized European shock troop warfare, like with the tercio, which is something we could cover in the future if people want that, with light cavalry. And that's so that way you have units that are very fast, highly agile and mobile and can hit the enemy quick and run away. And you also have the troops that can stand still and maintain sustained combat for hours on end and inflict massive damage on troops near them. The tertial formation essentially was a massive improvement. It was a form of a return of the phalanx, but a massive improvement where the phalanx was very unagile. The tertial formation was very agile, and that's actually what enabled Cortez in his conquest of Mexico. When he's fighting the Tlaxcala were just amazed at how well these tertial formations moved and operated on the battlefield, and they were just unbreakable from their perspective. Although one of the battles with the Tlaxcala, one of them nearly did break, but it didn't. And that's the Tlaxcalan kings, the chieftains, their caciques. They were fighting against Cortez because they thought he was if Cortez was creating trouble for Mexico City, for Tenochtitlan, for Montezuma, and so they were concerned that if they didn't stop him, that Montezuma would attack them. And after seeing how the Spanish tercios fought, as well as some of the natives that Cortez had recruited at that point and trained to fight as tercios, the Tlaxcalans, who recognized some of those natives that Cortez had in his makeshift army, realized, okay, so if these people who we outnumber 400-1 on the battlefield, if they're able to fight this well, and he can train those natives over there who are backwards compared to us, because the Tlaxcalans were very civilized in comparison, cities, giant high rises, pyramids, and stuff like that. If you can train these backwoods jungle natives to fight like how all these other Spanish tercios and Hispanic tercios are fighting, then he could train us how to fight like that. Right. And if we can fight like that, then we can beat the Aztecs, who are always raiding us for our children to sacrifice to their god. And that was part of what played into the calculation of the Tlaxcalans joining up with Cortez, and Cortez suddenly finding himself with 200,000 native troops that he had to train to fight like European shock troops.
Right.
So, and that's the thing too, like people don't realize the scale of combat in the conquest of Mexico compared to the settlements or the Indian Wars of that the United States had in North America. There's just no comparison at the sheer numbers of size. You just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of professional full-time troops on the field. That's an indicating of how complex, economically speaking, the central Mexican economy was. The fact that you could have a society where across all these tribes you had nearly 1 million full-time soldiers doing nothing but training and fighting and soldiering. Right.
Yeah. Regarding some of the, and that's what I was bringing up for Constantin, the radical self-sufficiency and individualism of the cowboy, is that my point as an Orthodox critique is that can be baptized. And, culture and the myth of the cowboy, the archetype of the cowboy, is an evolving imagery, right? That's the whole point of American civil religion and mythology, is that it can evolve. And the cowboy can come to represent, like in the future, of family values, of rootedness into a place and a people and a culture. It doesn't have to be the nomadic version, the Sigma version that we've talked about. We're just saying that is what the dime novels, that is what, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, that is what it promoted. That is what was viewed as an ideal of this man that's kind of liberated. And from an Orthodox critique, I think that can be baptized. And naturally, I think the cowboy as a critique can be seen as someone overly filled with pride. And what I mean by that is stoicism. And I would say that the American cowboy is a sort of stoic emblem. It's very easy for stoicism or a stoic to refuse repentance, confess weakness, or receive help. And in that sense, this is what I think, just like for Americans who convert to Orthodoxy, it's very difficult to kiss the hand of the priest for the first time. It's foreign. It feels like you're subjugating yourself to the authority of another man, right? It's very anti-American. And my point is that is part of the appeal, and that could be seen as part of the detriment of the archetype of the cowboy, along with violence. There's Richard Slotkin's major study in frontier mythology. He's another academic. And he examines the theory of American regeneration through violence. And he argues that the reason why the frontier is such a powerful mythos for the American mind and the cowboy as a figure is that unique to the American mythological framework is that regeneration comes from the meeting point of violence, whether that meant the U.S. with Native American tribes, the 13 colonies, the American Revolution, and think about it today with the civil religion of America and the military industrial complex, and how we're spreading democracy. The war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, Libya, that that the powers that be play off this if we're not conscious of it, that the American mind views regeneration and the restarting of American identity through violence, the meeting of violence. And so, and that's not my argument. That's Richard Slotkin's, who's an academic who's written about that. And I think there's something powerful to it, is that when Americans interpret crises, they view it as a violent confrontation. And this is what's so interesting about the revival of the cowboy right now, because we are existing in this multicultural, we have the rise. I mean, did you guys see what's going on in Dearborn, Michigan? Like, we literally have thousands of Muslims marching through the streets in Dearborn, Michigan, because some good old boys were in a pickup truck with an American flag saying, America will never be Muslim. Muslims go home. America is Christian. Now, whatever you think of that, thousands of Muslim men flock the street yelling Allah Akbar, and that America will be Islamic and all this different stuff, and that they're here. That was just a couple days ago, guys. And so my point about the American mind and its relationship with violence as a point of regeneration is that I don't think it's a coincidence when we're seeing immigrant communities taking over areas and territories of the United States, that the cowboy comes back as this archetypal figure for Americans to yearn for, a nostalgia. Why? Because the cowboy confronts violence, or confronts, uncertainty and crises with violence. And it is a sort of symbolic precursor to actual violence.
That's true. And unfortunately, it harkens back to something he said earlier about Theodore Roosevelt and how he did play a role in solidifying the American concept of the cowboy and the mythos, but also the fact that he's got that famous speech where he talks about no more hyphenated Americans. And the thing about that is that was actually the finalization of the process of erasing in the civic mind, erasing of the founding stock Americans. So I know by 1900, according to the census, which did keep track of founding stock Americans, only 37% of the population in 1900 was founding stock 13 colonies Americans. Like, that's how much the demographics had shifted in 124 years, or in the 109 years after the first Immigration Act, which ironically opened up immigration to anyone of a certain skin tone. Whereas before, the 13 colonies were very much, you look at their constitutions, their styles of government, except for like the Pennsylvania, because the Quakers were crazy, but the craziest form of crazy would be the right term to put it. But if you look at Virginia, you look at Massachusetts, you have this idea running through that the purpose of their governance was to secure the rights of Englishmen, to secure the traditional rights of an Anglo-Saxon man, of a yeoman, of a husbandman. And that was dead by but not Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson's view of the Anglo-Saxon yeoman farmer was dead by Theodore Roosevelt, and Theodore Roosevelt's speech is very much signifying that. It's like it's now a new form of lit pluribus unum. It's no longer the 13 colonies becoming one. It's now we've absorbed all these other Europeans who share skin tone, and so now we're just going to be one thing. Right. But that's part of why, one, you can't go back in time and restore how something was before. But in this case, it's worse in the sense of when the founding stock of a state is that diluted, that tells you something about the effectiveness of that state. And that's why, for example, like I do argue in my Substack that I'm not someone who's inclined to try to save the empire, because I look at the fruit of the empire, of how it functions for the last 250 years. If this empire endures, the one thing I know I'm guaranteed in 100 years is that my children will be a minority, no matter, like, 100 years from now.
Yeah.
And I can see it right now with the United States now bringing, Hindus in mass, not just Muslims, but
Yes.
Hindus in
Yes.
particular in the area where I am.
Yeah, with me too. They've taken over the entire area I'm from, which was growing up 90%, Caucasian.
Mhm.
And they brought in somewhere between the ballpark of like 60,000, 100,000 Indians in the last like 10 years.
Yep. And the thing is, I don't. There's nothing in the 250-year history of the empire, even the paused immigration thing they had. That's the best they had. They ever did, and it only lasted a couple decades, a handful of decades, and then doors open right back up. And the thing is, because it's just it's fundamentally it's the nature of republics. The nature of a republic with unrestricted usury, where I'm planning on. I'm actually have done the research on it, but I have a series that I'm writing up. I already got all the outlines and data done on the oligarchs that are competing for power within for the reins of the Republican Party, and it's fascinating how many of these oligarchs are driven by usury. And their wealth is from usury, explicitly so. Like the payday loan kings of Tennessee are one of them, and they've literally taken one out of every 66 Tennesseans to court over payday loans. So just the most predatory people you could imagine, and these people who make their money based on usury are the ones who support open borders, because that's more people they can turn into debt slaves.
Right.
And that's just been the consistent story of the United States since its founding.
Yeah.
The anti-usury element within the American, like heritage Americans. So that
Bring back Andrew Jackson.
Yeah. So you have Andrew Jackson, who was the last attempt at it. And there is an anti-usurist root with the Puritans up until 1700. The Puritans still held to that's actually something they had a gripe with both the Anglicans and the Catholics over, because Rome flipped on usury in the Fifth Lateran Council. The Puritans completely banned usury in their New England until the year 1700 when they flipped. And it's interesting because I was talking to my dad about this, and he's a Puritanophile. It was after that flip, interestingly enough, that's when in the wake of that's when Unitarianism and Universalism started spreading.
Right.
So it's just interesting how those tie together. And so when you don't have anyone when there's no sovereign who owns the nation, and you don't have a common religion that binds, not just horizontally but vertically through time, which is very critical for sacred monarchy to function. When you don't have that, all governance comes down to is power plays by oligarchs who are renting power and are seeking to maximize their own power and their own individual cash flow for their respective blocks. That's why you're always going to have party politics in a republic system and in a democratic system, and that's why you will always have, unfortunately, open borders, because it's more debt slaves. That's all they care about. And it's crazy. Like, even you look at the illegal immigrants, the amount of debt they get into when they cross the border and then they come to this country, it's absurd.
Right.
And it's absolutely absurd. And even the immigration reform back with Reagan, that was partially to prevent deflation. Because if you made a bunch of illegal immigrants legal, then they can get mortgages, they can get car loans. And given how the American monetary system is structured, every time a bank balance sheet expands, that's the monetary supply expanding. And the entire point, the goal of the Federal Reserve is, targeted inflation. The thing they're terrified of is deflation.
Right.
And so if people start paying off their debts and starting to live life debt free, that's a deflationary effect on the economy, and they don't want that.
Right.
So you got to bring in more people who can be new debt slaves.
Exactly. Regards to some orthodox critiques of the archetype, I'd say the last two that I have, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just me just sitting and reflecting and thinking about it, is one is revenge. So, I think revenge is sort of an idealized value of the cowboy regarding some of the Hollywood films, some of the dime novels. And I would say that's certainly not a Christian value per se. And maybe I'm taking a stretch on that one a bit, but I would say another aspect is that the cowboy as a American mythic heroic archetype can also lead to national idolatry, which is one of the problems with America itself, is this civil religion. And you see this amongst Protestants and evangelicals, right? Voting for Trump is somehow a divine order. voting for Trump is allowing God's providence to occur. We're going to save America through the legal system that I've mentioned before. I think for Protestants and evangelicals, because of the lack of a sacramental theology, in many ways, politics and voting act as a sacramental action that you can directly engage in sort of the providence of God's will for America, connecting back to Robert Bella's civil religion, right? Now I know Protestant evangelicals are praying to Christ and stuff, but this civil religion that somehow God is particularly concerned with America, right? A lot of people are operating under this presupposition. It may sound ridiculous or fanciful, but I mean, I myself grew up in the Midwest in a sort of conservative red Protestant area that, yeah, we're special. We're unique on history, that we have a special promise by God, and that we're protected by God. You know, God bless America, that somehow we never lose wars. We only help put the world back into order. You know, this is part of the civil mythology about America, and that the cowboy needs to be sanctified from the tentacles that could lead it towards a national idolatry, a sort of veneration of the cowboy as the, like I said, the American saint. The American saint. Now, as I said, there's a lot of good things. And I think the irony, one of the interesting things I pulled from the archetype is that the cowboy is also an ascetic. And I thought that, again, reflecting on, I think that's a very interesting aspect in the commodification and consumeristic culture we exist in today, and the cowboy being a consumeristic identity, right? So people are consuming the cowboy as an identity, and yet the cowboy in reality is sort of ascetic that is not a consumer. He's a producer. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And something I wanted to tie to that history too, the cowboy to immigration, because so in the wake of barbed wire and the closing of the West, a whole lot of charros down in, especially, south of I-10, found themselves without work. And at the time, of course, the U.S. had the problem of mass Chinese immigration flowing over the border of Mexico. And so the U.S. government set up Border Patrol. And for the job description, they wanted, horsemen who were good with a lasso. So the origin of the American Border Patrol, they hired like almost most of the original hires for the Border Patrol were Tejanos vaqueros who were out of jobs, and were literally lassoing Chinamen crossing the Mexican border, as well as illegal Mexicans too.
That's what we need. That's why the Border Patrol, they can't be on horseback anymore. After, what was it, like back in 2020? Wasn't it 2020 where the Border Patrol like lassoed one of the Mexicans, and it became a huge thing?
Yeah, and that's the sad thing. That was the tradition of Border Patrol. It's an attack on
that's just American tradition.
It's the Tejano tradition. Like it's just an attack. That's why, like, what do you call it? ICE and Border Patrol should be on horseback using lassos again. To not do so would be racist against Tejanos. So that's my official defense of the practice. But yeah, no, that's why you have this weird oddity with the United States. People talk about like, oh, Rome was, its borders were defended by barbarians, which is true. The thing is, that's true of the American government in the sense that it wasn't defended. The American borders historically the southern border has been historically guarded by Tejanos and New Mexicans. So it's just because that's who's there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great point. To wrap up, and then if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to ask, and we'll respond to the chat. Just to wrap up, and Jose, if you have anything else you want to add, I just wanted to come back to why the archetype of the country aesthetic is coming back. As we said, TV shows, music. I think country music is really the most indicative. Like Ella Langley's "Choosing Texas," for anybody who's familiar with pop culture, has set the Billboard 100 record for the most weeks at #1, breaking Madonna. And the only song, and it has to have a caveat, is the only song in American history that has a longer #1 is a Mariah Carey, one of her Christmas songs. So it's the longest non-holiday song ever on the Billboard 100. And that's interesting. Why is a song about a girl and her boyfriend, who's a cowboy, she loses him to a prettier girl from Texas because they have a shared identity, they have a shared culture, they have this thing that she can't offer as a girl from Tennessee. Again, insignificant. I'm not dwelling on the song, but it is interesting how impactful, how popular that is. What does that represent? And as I opened with, I had 8 points of why the cowboy is making a comeback. Number one is a yearning for identity. We live in the splitting of the American sacred canopy. We live in a fragmented identity. We live in a place in which many people question what is an American. And the cowboy is the last instantly intelligible American symbol, and so it lends itself very easily to a re-identification of America, an American. And leading to that, my point 8, and I'm going to connect it to point 2, when I talked about inheritance earlier. Every culture has something that should be passed on for the next generation to maintain. What do we have in America, right? Learning how to work on your car with your father, maybe gardening, farming, stuff like that. But the cowboy is symbolic of a sort of inheritance in which you receive something from your culture and you have then a responsibility to maintain it. And it is something that will diminish and go away. It's explicitly anti-technocratic, right? The cowboy is in opposition to the futuristic technocracy that our world is moving towards. Whether people are conscious of that or not, it makes it more and more appealing. It's something out in nature. It's something real. It's something embodied, right? The cowboy is not an industrial symbol. The cowboy is not in a factory. The cowboy is not the assembly line. That's what I was looking for. The American idea of the assembly line and mass manufacturing. That's not what the cowboy is. Rugged, individual, in the world, in nature. And so in addition to that, we're facing a masculinity crisis. Men don't even know what masculinity is, but the cowboy is an immediately tangible concept of masculinity, not just being theory, not just being concepts of get your Bugatti and your social status, but practical application of courage, competence, provision, protection of the innocents, women, children, the town that's being taken over by the bandits and the robbers. And so it lends itself very easily to a tangible concept of masculinity. And the same thing with is embodiment. That because we're in front of screens all the time, why is it that people sit in front of a screen to watch people like the show Yellowstone to, do cattle drives and they're horseback riding, they're out in the mountains. Notice that people are obsessed with that imagery and yet they're still watching it through a screen. The cowboy is embodied, right? The cowboy forces you to be like a cowboy, forces you to get out from behind a screen. There is no cowboy activity that takes place on a computer. And in that sense, the cowboy also represents place and culture, right? This is why, as I brought up earlier in the opening statement, why when the Europeans came for the World Cup and they were asked, oh, why are you getting cowboy hats? Why are you getting cowboy boots? They said, because we're in America. This is the American hero. This is when we think of America, we think of the cowboy on horseback and gunfighting. It's like, well, that symbolizes place. And right now, as we said, not only are Americans moving from place to place throughout their adult life, I think the average is 3 different locations an adult American lives in, outside the place in which they were born. So the cowboy, although he was nomadic, it represents the American place. It is explicitly American culture. No one, even though you mentioned Chile and Argentina and Spain and Mexico, certainly precursors, aspects, tangential archetypes of the cowboy, but the American cowboy, as we said, both its good and its positive and its negative attributes, is representative of a place that we can feel is leaving. Texas, Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, the West, and globalization is producing a placelessness. Right? Globalization and multiculturalism means there is no place. There is no there. Everywhere is the same place. And the cowboy is sort of that last piece of an actual unique American place, a unique American landscape, which is tied with the recovery of beauty. And my last point here is, well, I actually two more. Is one is moral clarity. Like the cowboy comes, and this is why I think it's so interesting. And even country music, there's always, usually in the songs, like there's something bad that's happened, or there's an ethical dilemma of some sort. Maybe there's cheating or whatever, or they cheated, or something's going on. There is moral clarity in this sort of Americana Western ethos that modern American culture does not have moral clarity. You know, you have one person telling you men can give birth. You have another person telling you, you know, that children can cut their genitals off and that's healthy for them. Well, what is right or wrong? There is no moral clarity. And so I think young people, why especially young people? Because as I told you in the beginning, when I looked up what genres of music are the most explosive in growth right now, it's Latino, like cultural, like Spanish music and country music. And the demographics are the youngest. That was what was so interesting, is that the demographics of hip hop and rap music is actually an older demographic than what's happening with like Spanish music and country music, American country music. Now, why is that? Well, the Spanish Latinos are looking for identity. They listen to this music. That's their people. That's, well, and then the same thing's happening in the American, specifically the white American population, is whether they're conscious of it or not. And then my last point of the cowboy, and why maybe at a subconscious level people are so compelled by it, is that it represents a freedom from managerial civilization. You know, he is symbolically in opposition to the blue-haired woman in your HR department. You know, bureaucracies, Zoom call meetings, algorithmic life dictated by, you know, your tech overlords. The cowboy is outside of that umbrella. Like he is not residing under those modern oppressive forces, your Kafka-like bureaucratic nightmare. So I think for all those reasons, all of that is contributing to this resurgence, this renaissance of the cowboy. Now, how long is it going to last? Is this going to continue for the next decade or so? Is it going to make a real change in American identity? Who knows? You know, I'm probably doubtful, but it's interesting nonetheless that this is a real phenomenon. And my point with the Spanish and country music is that it's not just a white American thing. We can literally see the Latino and Latina community doing the same thing with their own music. And that's what's popular among young people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say it's the loss of identity that's driving it. People are looking for something from the past. And I can see it even here where, as I mentioned before, I do live in a place where there actually are people who commute via horseback. But they will have their whatever the modern equivalent boombox is that you plug in your phone into today, tied to the horse. So it's funny in a doom scrolling sense. The older cowboys will be blasting rap, and the younger cowboys will be blasting country or ranchero, depending on which side of Key Avenue they're from. So it's yeah, so that's the thing too, because even in Spanish music, the thing that's making a comeback is the ranchero music, which is the music of the charros. It's the northern equivalent of or the northern Hispanic equivalent of country music.
Right. That's what I thought was so interesting. I mean, to me, the fact that that is the case in two linguistic cultures demonstrates that this is a real phenomenon happening right now.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so it's we'll see what happens. I mean, it's coming for a population that's dying, which is true for Hispanidad as well. Like we're in free fall. Despite the growth of Hispanics in America through the immigration, the thing is, Hispanidad as a whole has been shrinking, and now you have the United States leveraging for mass migration into South America, Central America, and you know, for example, the Jewish lady ruling Mexico is not going to stop that.
Yeah.
So I know, like in Colombia, like
not going to stop it. You're
shocking. Like they dumped a bunch of Sunni Afghans in Colombia, for example. That's so it's. Things are going to keep getting worse until frankly the power structure that rules the West finally dies, and I'm hoping that it's after that where I'm hoping my grandkids or great grandkids will get a breather. That's what I'm hoping. And time for repentance, time for producing, hopefully the in the parish life that they're involved in, producing saints.
Right.
So that's the
Well,
long-term
in
goal.
that dying culture for both parties, again, I'm a broken record here, but to reiterate the boundary point is that the cowboy puts order in places of chaos. Now, people are upset with this mass migration. People can feel the loss of identity. They can feel the losing of what they appreciate about being in America. And it's the cowboy as a symbol of violence that stands between the barbarian and the domesticated man, because some of these dime novels, if you go back to them, they are explicit in their portrayal of the East Coast man. He is domestic. He doesn't have a appetite for violence, and so therefore that's why it takes the cowboy to go there and set things straight, because the domesticated civilized man can't stop the brutality. He can only exist in essentially a conditioned world, and the world of the cowboy is unconditioned, and he can face that chaos and unconditionedness and establish order. And so, as you said, our cultures are under attack. Mass migration is happening. It's not going to stop. There is no sign that it's going to slow down. Whether it be the rancheros or country music here in America, it's like these are symbols of resistance. But the people listening are totally, not all of them, but I would suspect many of them are unconscious of it.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the cowboy is violent. And if this stuff continues, like the boundary, if the cowboy himself is the boundary, a liminal figure, but now he is the boundary of what American identity is. And as that boundary gets crossed, the cowboy gets violent. And I would suspect that these populations are also the only thing left to do is violence, because there is no voting, there is no economic movement to liberate yourself, there is no other options. It's reproduction and cultural progeny that happens generationally, and then it's only, look at history. The only thing that stops something is violence. That's the only thing that can make immediate end to something.
Mm-hmm. We're now at the point where in America you have a substantial portion of the population that is buying food with loans. That tells you how impoverished the United States is, and how much of people's earning power and labor power is being used solely for the sake of servicing existing loans that they can't even support themselves without, taking on even more loans. And unfortunately, how the U.S. is built, I mean, this relates to what we talked about last week. How the U.S. is built, I don't see there's no elite faction, no oligarchic faction that's going to push for shrinking the balance sheet the way that Xi Jinping has been doing for 5 years. Right. And by the balance sheet, I mean the balance sheets of all the banks, because that's how you deleverage an economy. The thing is, when you do that, that makes GDP go down, especially in a society whose economy is financialization. There's very little real economy left in the U.S. to backstop everything. So it's if you do a debt forgiveness, like on paper, GDP will go down by like more than half overnight. However, suddenly you have all these young people who can afford houses, afford cars, afford food, not be under the chains of student loans. And so, like, this is a form of where GDP shrinking would be fantastic for the population. I given that as a question before on the last stream, where I had mentioned how China has run the printing presses at twice the rate of the Federal Reserve, and yet China's had deflation for 5 straight years, and their housing market is still deflating. Things are still getting cheaper for young people. And the reason why is because, so I'll give the answer to that question I'd asked. I know someone put that $10 super chat in saying he was the target audience for this, but the answer to that question, the reason why China can run the printing press at twice the rate of the Federal Reserve and have deflation, is because almost all currency in circulation isn't created through deficit spending. It's created through private bank balance sheet expansion, which is loan origination. In the United States, the main driver is mortgages. If everyone were to stop getting a mortgage, like stop opening new mortgages tomorrow, and just for 3 months, no one originating a new mortgage, America would experience rapid deflation. a deflation to scale that it has never experienced, not even in the long depression. And that's what the Federal Reserve is tasked to prevent from happening. So the system needs you to get more and more in debt in order for it to function. And that's why, I don't see the United States having an autocrat who's going to be willing, because when a balance sheet of a bank shrinks, that shrinks what the amount of real assets a bank can have claims against, and it reduces the wealth of the owners of said bank.
Mm-hmm.
And given that America is run by oligarchic banking families, none of them are going to want to shrink their own holdings, shrink their own wealth for the sake of freeing the nation.
Right.
And that's the distinction. That's why, and we're talking about how, Thomas Jefferson read Greek and Latin. Like, no, the founding fathers were extremely capable. They're extremely literate. I don't know if this article, I got published already, if I publish it next week. But if not, if it's not been published already, it'll be either next week or the week after. But it was not an accident that the American Republic was designed on the model of the Roman Republic, according to Livy in his own in his history of Rome. When they overthrew their kings, one of the things the Roman kings would do regularly was forgive debts. And within 4 generations, within 100 years, like after the kings were overthrown and the Senate class had the power, the Senate class were the creditors. All the plebeians were rendered as debt slaves, and that resulted in multiple attempts at secession by the plebeians, where they're trying to get away from the debts that they had no hope of ever repaying. And the Senate, in the end, as a halfway measure, gave them the lower assembly that they could vote in as consolation prize for all of them being debt slaves. And that's the history of the Roman Republic all the way through, where you have as a dictator Julius Caesar, who gets assassinated not because he forgave debts, but because he threatened to forgive debts. And the Bruti were notorious usurers. So ergo et tu Brutus. And in the end, Augustine did actually do a limited form of debt forgiveness. And down the line, much larger debt forgivenesses happened with Emperor Trajan, not Emperor Trajan, his successor, Hadrian, who publicly did the debt forgiveness in front of Trajan's column. And down the line, debt forgiveness would expand further with the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And there's a book coming out in 1 month. Finally, Michael Hudson's publishing it, but it's the history of Western banking going back to the Great Schism and the financing of the Crusades.
Oh,
and I've been
read that.
Yes, because I was digging that history myself, and there's quite a lot of evidence, just from my own research, that the Roman Catholic Church achieved its ultramontanism through the backing of the banking families within Italy, the families who were practicing usury.
Medici's and
Yep. And this alliance with the usurer's power is how the medieval Catholic Church attained its power. That's how it financed and pushed the Crusades. Like the Templars extended the banking network into the Middle East, and that's the banking power that we rule over. This is the great irony, was established by the post-schism Roman Catholic Church. And there is an apologetic there that's extremely blatant. And then I found out while I was diving into this research that, like, oh, Michael Hudson's gone way, way deeper than I. And he was working on a book. And so I've been praying for the last, since I work full time, so I don't have much time. Last 14 months since Michael Hudson is, this is what he does for a job, and he's de facto retired, and he still writes, that he finishes it, because whatever he writes, I want to plan on making like an Orthodox version of it, because he doesn't understand Orthodox Christianity. He gets it completely wrong. Like it's funny. I think Jay asked years ago if there was such a thing as a bad apologetic for Orthodox Christianity, and there is. There was an article that Michael Hudson, the heterodox communist, wrote as an apologetic for Orthodox Christianity, and he got everything wrong, and it was terrible because he doesn't understand it. He looks at everything through a materialist lens. So he reduces Orthodox Christianity to a revolutionary movement led by Jesus Christ to oppose the banking apparatus. And so, it's hilarious because he looks at the Roman Catholic Church as the resurgence of the banking apparatus, which ironically,
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, which is
totally
true.
Disagree with Christianity being a economic reaction.
Yes, because that's what he defines Orthodox Christianity as, and it's hilarious too, because it's funny where we would look at the breaks for the various schisms, like when the Monophysites go off, or the Copts go off, the Armenians go off, the Roman Catholics break off. Most of us would look at it like, there's a break in practice, a break in theology, a break in agreement, and we could, in communion. And Michael Hudson just he boils it down to, no, this break happened because this group wanted to do usury, and that's he just sees. And the irony is there is a parallel there, but it's so he's not wrong per se, but it's just
I'm curious. It's very easy culturally to criticize the Catholic Church. There's no hit to your reputation or your professional life. I'm curious how deep he goes into the history of banking and usury.
Mhm. Yeah, that's I know, like his super imperialism was about the financial infrastructure of the American Empire. So that's what I'm looking forward to, and I'm looking forward. That book is supposed to come out in September. So
Interesting.
he
Well,
finished
keep me posted because I want to buy a copy too.
I shall. That's I got other reading I'm trying to get in the meantime, but if I haven't finished what I'm currently reading, then that's going to take top priority because I've been waiting for that for like 14 months.
Jacob makes a great point. He says Brokeback Mountain was produced by a bagel, James Shamus or Shamu or however you pronounce his last name. And I would say it's interesting you bring up Brokeback Mountain because based on the archetypes, masculine freedom, and that gets distorted just, what was it, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, into sodomizing your best cowboy friend. Like, oh, you want masculinity and freedom? Go sodomize your best friend.
Yep.
No. So yeah, not surprised with that one at all. Let's see, guys, go subscribe to Jose Substack. I got the link right here on the screen. Link is in the video description, hyperlink. So you just click it. It'll take you straight to a Substack. Go subscribe. Let's see. Major thank you to Steve the Turd, throws in 5, says, we look forward to your homeschooling curriculum. Give me time. Give me time. I will eventually do that. I promise. Thanks for your time. Lord be with you. You as well, man. God bless you and your family. And Paul throws in 10, says, I heard something about fancy hats. I have a fur felt taller top hat, my favorite hat. Makes me consider getting a poncho or sombrero. Hello, fellow Hoosier. How are you? Jose, what ethnicity are you?
Yep, Hispano. In particular, my dad is a mixture of Spanish, Danish, and Irish because the he comes from aristocratic stock. So they're all intermarried, and my mother's Colombian. So that's how I come about. And I was actually trying to move to my mother's country multiple times, but jobs kept falling through, and I kept getting called back to the United States. So like when some changes to rules related to HIPAA, which is the stuff that governs medical data, happened. I was at the time I was living in Colombia, and I got a call from my boss, and he was like, hey, you have to come back to the States right now, or you can't work. So it's so I gave up trying to make that work, and God's blessed me with a place where I feel at home at, where I do have a cultural connection to, and appreciation for the people around me. It's we're supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves. There's nothing wrong with when you're looking for where do you want to raise your family, picking a spot where the neighbors are more lovable. So to you,
right?
So,
yeah. Paul, I'm doing well, man. God bless you, fellow Hoosier. We got to stick together. I don't know if Kristen's in the chat. She's a fellow Hoosier. And I don't know if Journey of Abundance is in the chat. He's a fellow Hoosier. So us Hoosiers are representing. Jumbo Playset throws in 2, says, high quality work as always, gentlemen. Well, thank you very much, Jumbo Playset. God bless you. And Michael Nash threw in $20, no comment. Thank you very much, brother. Do appreciate it. God bless you and yours. And our brother Snagglebeast throws in 5. He says, here's a few coins in your cup, partner. God bless, Brother Patrick. Keep up the good work. Well, thank you, Snagglebeast. God bless you and yours. And let me know when Josiah is going to be making his appearance here to the Hoosier State. We may have to meet up, or maybe we can go to liturgy or get lunch or something one day. So let me just double check, make sure I don't miss anyone. Okay. So before we conclude, let's end off a high note here for everyone who appreciates and loves the Cowboy. I'm curious and I'll let you go first, Jose. I already have my response in mind. What is one takeaway for the audience of a beneficial value of the American Cowboy archetype that someone could implement or use or reflect upon in their own life in the 21st century in 2026, so divorced from the 1860s. I mean, we're talking 200 years ago. Well, no, we're talking about 150 years ago.
Mhm.
But what would you say is one thing you could take away? And then I have one.
If you're a man who's of poor means or broke or a debt slave, even the one wealth that cannot be taken from you is your skill set. So always invest in more skills, especially in the face of the decaying society that we're living in.
Yeah. And that's kind of that kind of touches on mine. Mine is self-sufficiency. Which is tied with his skill set. So I think Jose and I are kind of on the same page, is that especially in the face of automation, in the face of AI, the technocratic world that we're moving towards. I was just speaking with a young guy recently about how he's not sure what industry to go in or what he's supposed to do because AI and this or that. And it's like, just develop real skills, man. Like
Mhm.
a skill set you can't take away. And in terms of the skill set, self-sufficiency, like becoming competent, becoming less dependent on the system, less dependent on other people.
Mhm.
I think self-sufficiency, especially in modern America, is one thing all of us can incorporate more of, without venturing into sin or pride or, the rugged individualism. But becoming self-sufficient is something that will help, I think, most people. Now, obviously, it can lead into pride and rejecting communion, as we mentioned before. But I think that's something that a lot of people could find liberating for their own lives, is developing a self-sufficient skill set, which incorporates more than just one skill set, right? I'm in favor of the revival of the Renaissance man. Now, I'm not talking about the Renaissance or Renaissance humanism, but I'm talking about the fact most people don't realize that there was a transition on what the ideal man was. When the Renaissance man is a generalist, right? He can do a little bit of everything. And back during the Renaissance and even the medieval period, this was perceived as ideal. The man is holistic. The man has multiple skill sets. It isn't really post the scientific revolution, but certainly after the Enlightenment, where everything moves towards specialization. I mean, after Hegel kind of represents the last attempt of system building, like developing your own totalizing philosophical system. And really from Hegel forward, I think philosophy, academia, education, government dove more into specialization, where now we have people who are highly specialized in a specific thing, but they're not holistically masculine, whole, capable, competent. And I think a goal for all men is to become not a Renaissance humanist, but colloquially the Renaissance man, someone who has multiple skill sets, right? You don't need to be, hyper. Oh, I'm a coder. I don't need to learn how to work on my car. It's like, no, learning how to do everything is what makes you self-sufficient and makes you less dependent on the system.
If you want to work on your car today, you have to be a coder. This is the great irony.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah, anything with a computer, yeah, you're already screwed. Did you see that the CEO of Ford Motor Company talked about it? He ended up backtracking, but he was like, "Well, yeah, now it's actually a bad idea to work on your own cars. You need to take them to a registered dealer." And he's talking about all the computer stuff, and it's like, well, that defeats the whole point of what made Ford Ford.
Yeah.
Like,
The sad thing is, he's not wrong in the sense that these things are designed not to be repairable.
yeah,
And it's effectively required by law. That's the sad part. It's and that's going to have huge implications with the collapse of the United States. All these new cars are worth trash. Like I'm in the junk car business, and it's turning into more and more of a gold mine because a Toyota Camry from 1995 that's been well taken care of. You can run that thing forever. So that's just not the case of all these new junk cars that are way overpriced, don't deliver for even old prices back in the 90s or aughts. Right. It's for those looking for cars, you want to find something that's special, at minimum pre-2015, that you can keep running and you maintain and you keep it going. If the only thing that's like new vehicles that you could run forever, would be essentially now it's just motorcycles at this point. So like a Kawasaki Vulcan 900, if you bought a 2024 one of those, or a Honda Rebel 1100, like a 2026 brand new one, those are vehicles you can keep running for more than 100,000 miles easily. And if you have it indoors in a garage, you could have that bike going for even 200,000 miles. Like some of those Honda engines and Kawasaki engines are just absolutely bulletproof, and the transmissions are great too. I mean, in the case of the Rebel, it's just a chain which you replace. But even like the old school, I even considered like an old school Honda VTX 1300, because those things are just bulletproof and they keep going. They got a shaft drive transmission that, in theory, I've known guys who've taken them more than 250,000 miles and they're still going smooth like the day they started. This is a great irony. I wonder if with cars becoming more and more illegal to have a car that works, I do wonder if the motorcycle would actually make a comeback as a use vehicle rather than an entertainment vehicle, because that's the only place where you're allowed to build something that's reliable, that you can work on, and that's inexpensive. Cars used to be that way, but it's illegal. And I did have an article on that related to the deregulation that Trump did. It's so technically right now, like the fine for violating the CAF standards, which is what sets the fleet MPG standards, is set to $0. So in theory, Ford could build a reliable car. Problem is, there are two problems with that. One, the next administration could just dial the fine back up, and then you're screwed. So now you're introducing political risk, so no company's making any move. The other problem is the deregulation, how Trump did it, or whoever decided within the Trump administration did it. It removed how electric cars affect the MPG of the fleet. So now the MPG target, even though it's no longer going up as quick, it has to be hit with actual gas vehicles, not without the benefit of having electric cars that drag the fleet numbers up. The consequence of that is electric car lines get shut down. However, you're still going to see the unreliable 1.5 liter turbocharged engines that Honda's been putting out that blow up at 40,000 miles, because that's the only way they can get those MPG fleet numbers. Right. So until CAF is like fully repealed, or even for that matter, like the NFA is destroyed, there's so much that needs to be done to make it where building bulletproof cars in the 90s can be done again. And I don't know if we're going to have an elite that installs a governance class that would actually do that. I don't see any oligarchs that in particular that are thinking of that, like the durability of a vehicle fleet, which is, frankly, it is a war asset. Today, the article I released today was on the comparison of the surveillance system of China versus the United States, because both are building massive surveillance apparatuses. Interestingly enough, despite China being bigger and much more dense urban-wise, China actually is a little bit smaller than the U.S., and what's fascinating is the architectural decisions that they made for their surveillance system compared to the United States. The United States surveillance system it's a private-public partnerships operating on the open internet that maximizes the dragnet to learn everything possible about everyone who is, underneath or is a subject of the American empire. Right. They want nothing to be private whatsoever. The Chinese, on the other hand, so they still have a surveillance system. They still want to, spy on people. But they intentionally made architectural decisions that compromise their ability to spy on the masses the same way America does, because of their overall military strategy. They made architectural decisions that harden their surveillance system so that it cannot be seized by a foreign threat or by a foreign adversary, and that it could not be seized and made usable by a foreign adversary that managed to do a successful amphibious invasion into the Chinese heartland. So choices like that mean that ideally from the Chinese outset, they wanted to have it where everything could be seen from Beijing. But that's not actually doable in their system because of the architectural choices they've done, which essentially creates firewalls. Their entire surveillance system is off the internet. It's a completely air-gapped system. And it has multiple firewalls because if someone manages to get inside one of those systems, they want to be able to sever that group from being able to access the rest. And the tactical reason and strategic reason for this, Russia has been able to, the reason why Russia's missile accuracy has been so high and even their fab bomb accuracy has been so high is because Russia can tap into the internet and hack every single webcam, camera, phone, and monitor not just everything in Ukraine and all the troop movements and logistics movements, etc., but also monitor every single logistics line from NATO countries into Ukraine, because all of that is accessible on the internet. And that's something China doesn't want any foreign adversary to be able to do. So the grand irony is the American ruling class, elite class, when looking for a system where they can micromanage everybody's lives and not micromanage, but spy on every single little detail of every single person under their rule, while also making that data available in a manner that can be run, that can be crunched privately by like think tanks, etc., or by the private companies that are doing the data collection themselves, like Flock. All that is to maximize the mineability of the data. But when you do that, for manipulating the masses, but when you do that, that means foreign threats. It makes it easier for foreign threats to access all that data and both use it for military purposes to spy on and identify targets,
right,
as well as mine that same data and on your host population. So the great irony is, because of how these surveillance networks are set up, China can access everything that the U.S. government can see about the American people. America cannot access at all what China can see. And China itself has taken steps, architectural design steps, that do hamper its ability to spy on its own people to a degree, for the sake of making sure that America cannot spy on the Chinese. So
interesting.
Anyway, I know that's not related to the
No, still very, very interesting. The D. Plaxton says no fuel injection. That's right. We need to go back to carburetors and no computers.
Yeah, the issue with that is because they put ethanol in the gasoline, so that messes up the carburetors.
Oh yeah.
Because I have done work in the past on carbureted bikes, and there's a way that you can distill the ethanol out, which is still worth doing because it increases the lifespan of wear and tear parts in the engine. But the crazy thing is, fuel injection in a motorcycle is not the end of the world compared to a car, because they're essentially programmed to function just like a carburetor, because you can't actually, there's no efficiency gain really from fuel injection with a modern bike. The only thing you gain with fuel injection is you don't have to worry about the ethanol gumming up the carburetor, or coming up the fuel injection the way it would gum up a carburetor. And it's in the case if it's on a motorcycle, like if you get a cruiser, like a Honda Rebel cruiser, that'll be the only computer, and that's the only thing. And if you have some knowledge of C, you can even program the fuel injector yourself. It's very easy to replace. So it doesn't make the motorcycle overly complicated the way it does with a car.
XX Lockstep through and 5 says, great collab as usual. Great topic. Going for a rewatch on this one. Well, thank you, Lockstep. God bless you, brother. Thank you for the support. And last super chat is Paul. Throws in 10, says, Jose, you said Hispanics should read Russian history. I always felt a need for living off the land and tight community. It hurts because my family isn't close and fell apart. It hurts. I hate cities.
Mm-hmm. So the thing is, traditional Hispanic urban life was very communal family life. Like I think I mentioned in the past, like it was one ex down in Colombia. She had 36 cousins living within 5-minute walk of her parents' apartment. So everyone lives together in that same locale. Each part of the city is truly its own neighborhood where everybody knows each other. You have that communal life, usually centered around a Catholic parish, of course, given it's Colombia. But that's the normal of city life. You see the same thing in Moscow in the 16th century, in Tsarist Russia in general, where you have, again, like within cities, you had communal life centered around a given parish, with the center of the city being, the cathedral. Or in the case of Moscow, you have multiple cathedrals, which, serve as various centers or various gravitational centers. So urban life can be beautiful. The thing is, urban life is so atomized and it's so hostile. And the injection of diversity into every single company, every single community means you don't have natural communal relations forming and happening. New York was actually a pleasant place. New York City was a pleasant place to be in back when you had Little Italy as Little Italy, Little Chinatown as Little Chinatown, Dutch Harlem as Dutch Harlem, etc. All that's died with mass immigration, affirmative action, and of course, blockbusting, and the Civil Rights Acts that completely destroyed normal, healthy urban life. And so all that's left is for people to flee. And that's why you have this constant fleeing towards the suburbs, and then from the suburbs trying to homestead. It's a constant running away from the problems that result from essentially what the Civil Rights Act effectively did is ban natural community. That's what it did. And that's why people are constantly fleeing, and that's why Americans feel so atomized, because they are.
And that's what happened to like the Italian, Irish conclaves in major cities. Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. There used to be entire European ethnic neighborhoods, and then with the civil rights and the bringing up so many African Americans from the South to the North, displaced so many of those neighborhoods. And really, I would say, without that, there is no concept of the whites or white, because naturally Europeans fragment themselves based on culture and language and religion. But because of that, the civil rights and that displacement, there is like this general, I guess, white American culture. But even that's why, to me, white is a globalist psyop in a way, because it totally dilutes the unique identities of Europeans.
And this is the thing with Theodore Roosevelt. His speech. It's eliminating the hype of the American, destroy the identity, and just leave white as the after effect. He was heralding what was going to come with civil rights, the breaking of these communities, these natural communities. And very soon after he gave that speech, under the Wilson administration, you had the American government actively putting government agents into like here in Texas, I know, like into the German Catholic churches, the German Lutheran churches, and the Czech churches as well, Catholic churches, to make sure that homilies are not being given in German and in Czech. So it's, And in terms of reading the Russian history part, check out History of the Russian State. 8 of these volumes have been translated so far by some fellow in England, of Nikolai Karamzin. So that's
I've never read those.
Yep, he just started translating them in 2025. He finally started publishing them in 2025.
Where did you buy those? Off Amazon?
Yeah, that's the only place I found them. He's self-published, so I don't know.
Called The History of the Russian State.
States, yes. So I cannot vouch for the quality of the translation. I'm currently, my goal is to read the 7 volumes that I have.
How's the pagination? Sometimes when people do their own translations, it's super small text, or the text is at the end of the. Is it look decent?
Yeah, it's decent. It's decent enough. So it's just the notes at the bottom that are.
Oh yeah, that looks decent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been scammed on Amazon. You get these out of print books, and somebody, some independent printer, and then you open it, and it's the words go all the way to the edge of the page, and you're like,
exactly. Yeah, the guy who's working on it is a guy named Tim Buds. I'm hoping he finishes the remaining 4, and I reached out to him to see if I could get volume 1 because it's out of stock on Amazon. So I plan on reviewing it. The problem is I'm not fluent in Russian, so I can't review it for the quality of the translation, but at least reviewing the quality of the work as I can of that he's done into English. So it's I do recommend, it's at least for Hispanidad, if you want to, because again, the Soldados de Cuerda, the Cossacks, there's so many parallels with the Russian state, and the fact is the Spanish Empire was an attempt to have Sinfonia within the Western Catholic framework. That's why the Patronato Real was a thing, where you had essentially the imperial church was autonomous from Rome, with the Synod in Toledo being essentially the people whose opinions mattered for the Hispanic masses, and you had this relationship of the Synod of Toledo and the Spanish crown working together for the maintenance and running of the empire, and that's why the papacy was the huge gainer with the collapse of the Spanish Empire, because they then got Peter's Pence, which they weren't getting before. The Roman Inquisition now had authority over all the territory that formerly the Spanish Inquisition had authority over. This enabled them to be able to push through Vatican I of infallibility, which is something that never would have been pushed through if the Patronato Real still existed, because even I pointed out this before, even the Council of Trent had no binding authority in the Spanish Church until the Synod in Toledo had their own council and approved it line by line. So it's and so that's the thing. So Russia, on the other hand, did actually have successful Sinfonia for centuries up until Peter the First, and that's what I think
Peter the Great. I mean, he was great in the Northern War, but and he was great in updating the Russian Navy. Really wasn't great for the church.
Yeah, and you can read Saint Tsar Nicholas II's opinion of him. He had a very low opinion.
I've never read Tsar Nicholas's opinion of Peter the Great.
Yeah, get the. Let me get the book. Here we go. So get your hands on the Romanov Royal Martyrs. This book. So it's excellent. Sorry, yeah, excellent breakdown of all of them, of all the royal martyrs, and it does cover the relationship between Saint Tsar Nicholas II and his father. A lot of good excerpts of their letters and conversations, and it also does go over his opinion of Tsar Peter I.
Interesting.
So, yeah,
I take that he wasn't too fond.
correct. He himself saw Tsar Peter I as the one who laid down the spiritual groundwork for the rise of the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, well, he's not wrong in a way. He did. He was totally enamored by the West and Paris, and
Yep.
you know what, the Western Enlightenment. He was a Chad figure, though. My God, the dude was like 6'8" and was like
Yep.
it would have been so intimidating. Like early
Yep.
1700s, this just fucking massive Russian leader.
Yep. And the thing about, not being quick to judge, just realize Peter the Great fasted far harder than most likely any of us here. If anyone here fasted as hard as he did, I'd be amazed. I don't know anyone he was very ascetic in that regard. But unfortunately, his actions for pushing for Westernization was also the seed that enabled the corrupting of the aristocratic class of Russia.
Absolutely. I covered that in the Bolshevik and communist persecution, is that you read, oh my gosh, I forget what the author was, a Russian author. I'd have to go back, but it's kind of the book. It was written, I think, in the mid 1980s. It's sort of the book. It's done by a Russian academic on the persecution of the church and the church through the entire Soviet era.
Mhm.
And in that book, he's very explicit on the onset that the peasantry, the lower classes of Russia, were Orthodox, very pious, and maintained that. However, by 20, 30 years, even before the Bolshevik Revolution, the aristocrats were already very much wanting to be Westerns. And in that book, he said, you can't understand the Bolshevik Revolution without understanding the difference between the average Russian and the aristocratic, the aristocratic elites who were wanting to be more of a Western and adopt Western values, Enlightenment, contemplating atheism or perennial, all this stuff, is that they were already moving away from the Orthodox Church while the average Russian already, was ready to maintain that.
Yep.
So,
and I would say I'd put it on two sides of the era, the departure from Symphonia in the East and West. You see the departure happening both directions. Both result in the collapse of said civilization. So in the case of Tsar Peter, you have the crown taking over the church effectively and hampering it, and that results in the destruction of the crown. Whereas in the West, you have the papacy that assumes authority over all kings, and you have an ecclesial body taking over all secular, essentially subjugating all secular power. And what does it result into? The Protestant Reformation. And the chain there is when, with the Pope taking over secular power, you had the need of secular law, and so you have this process of codifying and centralizing the canons, because canons in the West, like in the East, were very local. And that was a problem for if you have the Pope over there and he's determining everything, and you have all these local canons that may at times, because they're pastoral rulings, rule against each other. Like a ruling in Flanders versus a ruling in Asturias. So you have this project by Gratian, condensing all this using Roman legal precedents, and you have the transformation of the canons from a pastoral rulings into a actual civil code, like legal code. And of course, the philosophy behind that to justify that was legal voluntarism, which gives birth to William of Ockham, who simply takes legal voluntarism and applies it to philosophy and epistemology outside of law. And that's how you get nominalism. And out of nominalism, you get Calvinism and Luther.
Right.
So the great irony is, like, papal supremacy, the ultramontanism and papal supremacy, its consequence was the Protestant Reformation, philosophically speaking.
Right. All right, gentlemen, ladies, smash that like for everyone who's here. A major thank you to everyone who supported. Guys, go follow Jose on his Substack. Link is right here. Link is in the video description. While you're over on Substack, go give me a follow. I just posted the study guide to St. Olga, Kiev, over there, and I'll be. I got articles. I'm taking Jose's advice. I'm trying to store up articles before I start posting articles, and not be on a hamster wheel like I am with video content, where you got to prepare and then do it and then start over again. So I'm trying to stock up and build up some articles, and yeah, and I may put this together something short based on everything that Jose and I shared today, just basically an overview of today's topic. If that's something you guys like, I can start putting together small overviews and posting those on Substack as well, just so it's easier to glean what it is that Jose or I are trying to talk about. Right now we're at 3.5 hours. So sometimes it's hard. You can get lost in 3.5 hours of audio of like, what were the most big significant takeaways, but maybe doing that would be beneficial. So go give Jose a follow on Substack. Go support him over on Buy Me a Coffee. That link is in the video description. It's a hyperlink. Just go straight to it. Open the video description. It'll take you right there. So Jose, anything you want to say, share, last words, promote, shill, whatever you want to do, it's all you.
Yeah, it's just amazing how the deeper you dive into American history and getting the fuller picture, I do find it interesting how, sure, people think about the annexation of Texas as the beginning of America and Texas, but the reality is the Texan population, long before the Americans came, was deeply involved in the birth of the American nation. So there is, it's not, this is, what I consider a coincidence of history, not a coincidence of history, providence in history. I don't think there's another place in all of Hispanidad where a man like Brandon Herrera could result, where you have, essentially Tejano's influenced by Scotch-Irish culture, and you have your gun nut bro who's, bought the first suppressor that has without an ATF approval in, 1 century. So it's something to think about. As I look at America as there is potential there for a true imperial identity, the same way that the Roman identity was. But the fundamental problem that we see, and we can see with the cowboy, even the cowboy mythos, the breakdown of local folk culture destroys. Without that local folk identity, you don't have a rootedness. You don't have that vertical through time identity that gets passed down, father to son, mother to daughter. And without that lack of identity, identityless swaths, as Theodore Roosevelt refers to it as, unhyphenated Americans. At that point where the great irony is this attempt by the ruling class to have all loyalty only to the central state, the destruction of any competing local identity results in the deracination and destruction of those masses. So that's a thing to consider. Like in terms of, one has to order oneself before one can order one's house, before one can order one's society. Right. And it's the same thing of, in the face of mass migration that we're experiencing now, unless you instill rootedness in your children, you're going to be powerless against this attempt to reforge or remake the imperial identity into based on what I'm seeing, some Hindu-Muslim combination.
Yeah. The Pagetification of America.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I'm going to be back tomorrow, 6:00 p.m. tomorrow. The Jay Dyer will be with me, and we're going to be going over the latest interesting geopolitics and news, and we'll be getting his perspective on a wide variety of topics. So do join me tomorrow night, 6:00 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be with Jay Dyer, and I will see you guys then. Jose, thank you very much, brother. God bless you and the family. Guys, go subscribe to his Substack. Go buy him a coffee. Help our brother out. I know you guys, because I'll get the comments afterwards. Everyone says, gosh, I love Jose. He's so smart. Go support the man. Go to his Substack and read his articles. If you like what he has to say, you're going to like his articles. They're awesome. So
I appreciate it.
Of course, man. Of course. So, as always, until tomorrow at 6 p.m., God bless.